Hey guys, tonight we are going to take a long, drowsy walk through the uneven cobblestones of ancient Rome, following the utterly unhurried saga of how bread recipes wandered, changed, and somehow stayed exactly the same for centuries. Picture the pre-dawn streets, a faint glow from a few flickering oil lamps, and somewhere down a narrow alley, the steady crackle of a bakery's clay oven warming up. A faint scent drifts toward you, wheat, yeast, and a hint of wood smoke. And you know this will be a slow morning in the best possible way. You'll be right in the middle of flour-dusted benches and men with forearms like marble statues, except softer because they've been kneading dough for the last 20 years. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive this, mostly because Roman mornings involve far too much standing around in cold air without coffee. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake just before dawn in a cramped insula apartment, the sound of muffled footsteps from the bakery downstairs pulling you out of dreams. The city is still half asleep. A donkey brays somewhere near the river, and the street sweeper's broom scratches faintly against the stones. You shuffle into sandals and step outside, guided by the smell of baking bread, your nose acting like the GPS of 2,000 years ago. The air is cool, carrying the salty tang from the Tiber and the slightly sour aroma of fermenting dough. The bakery's front shutters are propped open, revealing a warm, orange-lit cave. Inside, a row of domed clay ovens radiates heat like miniature suns. These are ferns, the heart of the Roman bread world, each one fed with bundles of pine and olive wood that hiss when damp sap meets fire. Bakers move in slow, purposeful motions, their tunics dusted with flour so thick it looks like they've been caught in a snowstorm. A boy, probably the baker's son, stands on a stool, reaching into a large wooden trough. His small hands disappear into a mound of dough, folding and pressing with a seriousness far beyond his years. The smell is hypnotic. Warm yeast, toasted grain, and the faint sweetness of wheat from far-off provinces. Historians still argue whether the baker's day began at midnight or a few hours later, but either way, you're here early enough to watch the first loaves take shape. You lean against the doorframe, feeling the warmth spill over you like a blanket. Behind the ovens, sacks of grain are stacked in neat piles, each marked with chalk symbols showing where it came from: Africa, Egypt, or Sicily. A passing thought occurs. These humble loaves are more traveled than most Romans you know. A baker with arms like bread paddles slides a row of round loaves into the oven, their pale dough dimpling under his fingertips. The paddle scrapes softly against the clay, and then he steps back, wiping sweat from his brow with the same cloth he uses to grab the bread later. In a few minutes, the crusts will start to brown, and the bakery will fill with that rich, toasted smell that makes people stop mid-sentence and turn toward the source. You're not in a hurry. You watch as the first loaf emerges, steam curling from its split top. It's set on a wooden rack to cool, though cooling is relative. Within seconds, the baker's wife slices it open to check the crumb, releasing another wave of aroma so thick you feel it in your chest. She gives a nod. No words, just the universal sign that yes, this bread will sell out before the sun climbs over the rooftops. You imagine the rest of the city slowly waking. The senator's breakfast table will have loaves from this bakery, the soldier down the street will grab a chunk before heading to the barracks, and a young couple will share one on the steps of the fountain, feeding crumbs to the pigeons that strut like they own the place. You're here for all of it, but you're in no rush. This morning, like the recipe itself, is in no hurry to change. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know this scene will repeat tomorrow and the day after, and for years to come. That's the charm of the long, uneventful march of these recipes. They are stubborn in their simplicity, quietly anchoring the city while politics and empires rise and fall outside. And so you stay, letting the warmth and scent of the bakery seep into you, watching the first light of day spill across the loaves like honey over a fresh crust. You step away from the bakery's warm doorway and into the thinning shadows of the street. The air still carries that faint sweetness of wheat, but now another scent rides the breeze: dusty, sun-baked grain, the kind that has traveled hundreds of miles to reach this city. Your feet take you toward the river docks, where the journey of bread begins, not with ovens and paddles, but in faraway fields under entirely different skies. The wheat of Rome is a traveler. Some of it comes from Sicily's gentle hills, some from the windswept plains of North Africa, and much of the finest from the fertile Nile Delta. Imagine Egyptian farmers in the pre-dawn light, bending over rippling fields of Emmer and Durum wheat, the stalks swaying like a golden sea. The air there hums with insects and the soft splash of irrigation channels. A farmer wipes his brow, straightens his back, and looks at a harvest that will in time end up as someone's breakfast in Rome, someone like you. The process is long, deliberate, and entirely without rush. After cutting the wheat with short, curved sickles, the farmers lay it out to dry under the relentless sun. Later, it's threshed with oxen plodding in slow circles, hooves breaking the husks with the same rhythm they've kept for centuries. Historians still argue whether certain Roman bread recipes depended strictly on Egyptian grain, claiming subtle differences in flavor and baking quality, though you suspect most people back then just cared whether their loaf was fresh and the crust pleasantly chewy. From the farms, the grain is loaded into large baskets and carried to the Nile on broad-backed donkeys, their ears flicking lazily against flies. Then it's tipped into wooden barges that drift downstream, riding the current toward Alexandria. The city is a thunderous mix of markets, shouting vendors, and the crash of waves against the stone docks. Here the grain meets the great Mediterranean. Its second-long journey begins. Roman grain ships are not graceful things. They're wide-bellied, slow, and built to carry as much cargo as possible. You board one in your mind, feeling the rough planks under your sandals and smelling the salty air mingled with the faint mustiness of sacks stacked to the ceiling. Sailors lounge on deck, adjusting the sails to catch a sluggish wind. Below, the grain rests quietly, unaware that it's heading toward its destiny as bread. The voyage is slow, weeks, sometimes months, depending on the season. Storms can halt progress entirely, leaving the ship anchored in some sheltered cove. You imagine the captain grumbling about the weather while chewing on the hard, bland ship's biscuit that makes you suddenly grateful for the bakery's warm loaves. Seagulls wheel overhead, occasionally landing on the rigging to eye the deck in case someone drops a crust. When the ship finally reaches Ostia, Rome's bustling port, the grain is unloaded in a methodical, almost ceremonial process. Dock workers, their arms roped with muscle, carry the sacks in steady lines toward massive warehouses called horea. These buildings smell of dry earth and chaff, their high windows letting in slices of dusty sunlight. Inside, clerks with wax tablets tally every sack, recording its origin and weight. You can almost hear the scratch of the stylus on the wax. From Ostia, the grain makes its way up the Tiber River on smaller boats, each one piled high, wobbling slightly with the weight. The river's calm, the banks lined with willows, and the occasional fisherman casting a lazy line. By the time the cargo reaches the city proper, the sun is dipping low, and the grain's journey, months in the making, is nearly done. Standing there at the docks, you think about how every loaf in Rome is a piece of geography. A bite might carry the heat of the Egyptian sun, the tang of salt air from the Mediterranean crossing, and the faint mustiness of the Tiber's banks. And yet, when it's finally set in front of you, it's just bread, familiar, comforting, almost boring in its reliability. Maybe that's why the recipe hasn't bothered to change. It doesn't need to. You brush a bit of imaginary grain dust from your hands and turn back toward the city. Somewhere a mill is waiting for this wheat, its great stones ready to turn, slowly and without drama, just as they have for generations. That's where you're headed next, carried along by the thought of flour drifting through the air like lazy snow. You follow the steady creak of wooden wheels and the muted thump of hooves until you reach the edge of a courtyard where the millstones are already turning. The sound is rhythmic, almost hypnotic, stone against stone, grinding grain into flour with a patience that feels eternal. A faint haze of white dust hangs in the warm air, settling gently on the hair, shoulders, and eyelashes of everyone nearby. The Roman mill is a solid, almost stubborn-looking thing. Two great volcanic stones, one stationary, one revolving, are locked together in a slow embrace. A wooden beam juts from the upper stone, and at its end, a donkey plods in a perfect circle, eyes half closed as if it's walked this path in its dreams. The air's warm and dry, carrying a nutty scent as the grain cracks and softens under the relentless pressure. Historians still argue whether volcanic stone from certain quarries produced superior flour, or whether that was just a marketing trick by clever mill owners. Slaves work alongside the donkey, shoveling grain into the narrow funnel at the stone's center. You watch the kernels disappear, then reappear moments later as pale, silky flour spilling onto the wooden catch tray below. It's mesmerizing. The transformation from golden grain to fine powder, the way the flour clings to their skin so they look like ghosts in tunics. One man wipes his brow, leaving a streak of clean skin across his forehead like an accidental war stripe. The pace is slow but steady. Each rotation of the stone feels deliberate, as though rushing would be somehow impolite to the grain. You step closer and run your fingers through the fresh flour. It's soft, cool, and just slightly gritty, sticking to your fingertips. In that instant, you understand why bakers speak of flour like it's a living thing, each batch with its own mood, its own way of behaving under water and heat. In one corner of the courtyard, another mill works under human power alone. Two slaves push a wooden handle in unison, their bare feet finding the exact same beat, like a low-energy dance that never ends. There's a kind of camaraderie between them, quiet smiles, shared grunts, and the occasional muttered joke about the donkey getting the easier job. A small child, maybe 6 years old, sits nearby with a basket, picking out stray bits of chaff that escape the winnowing. Every so often she sneezes into the crook of her arm, sending up a puff of flour so fine it sparkles in the slanting light. You can't help but think that for her the smell of grinding grain will be the smell of home for the rest of her life. Nearby, a woman in a worn but clean tunic kneels over a stone quern grinding flour for her own household. The rhythm is different here, smaller, faster, more personal. She hums softly to herself, perhaps the same song her mother sang while doing this work. It's a reminder that not all flour passes through grand mills. Some of it is made in kitchens and courtyards, a little at a time. You notice how the flour is gathered into cloth sacks, each tied at the neck and marked with a faint charcoal symbol, an R for the baker on the corner, a V for the villa up the hill. The sacks are carried off on shoulders or loaded into small carts, trundling away toward kitchens and ovens across the city. Somewhere in that quiet procession, you spot a sack destined for the baker you visited earlier, and you imagine it arriving just in time for the next batch of dough. There's an odd comfort in the way this part of the process has no urgency. The donkey doesn't hurry, the stones don't speed up, and no one shouts for faster work. It's as though everyone here has silently agreed that bread will be ready when it's ready, and trying to force it would only spoil the taste. A man leans against the mill's outer wall, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a spoon. He looks over at you and says something about how the Romans may conquer lands and build roads, but the real empires run on bread. You're inclined to agree. Without this slow, steady grinding, the city's rhythm would falter, like a song missing its beat. By the time you turn to leave, a fine layer of flour has settled on your shoulders. Marking you as someone who's lingered too long in the mill, you brush it off half-heartedly, but a bit clings stubbornly to your sleeve, a quiet souvenir of this patient, dusty place. You walk away toward the smell of yeast and warm dough, ready to see what happens when this flour meets water in hands that know exactly what to do with it. You slip from the mill's sunlit courtyard into a back room where the air is cooler and the world quiets to a hush. A long wooden table runs beneath a shuttered window. Dust motes float like patient stars, and the flour you brought with you settles in a soft crescent across the board. A clay jar of water rests near your elbow, its sides sweating in the faint morning cool. No one speaks. This is the good part. The quiet choreography where grain remembers it is becoming bread. You tip the flour into a shallow mound and press a well in the center with your knuckles. The dough-to-be breathes invisibly, the way a room seems to inhale before a bell rings. You pour in water with the caution of someone filling a bird bath, then draw the edges inward. Your fingers meet paste, tacky and reluctant. It clings to your skin as if surprised by company. You scrape, fold, press, and the rhythm takes hold. Push with the heel of the hand, turn, collect the stray bits, repeat. There's a steady creak from the table that sounds like an old friend agreeing with you. A jar of leaven sits nearby, yesterday's saved piece, a sleepy lump that smells faintly of apples and clean barns. Mainstream fact, Roman bakers commonly kept a piece of fermented dough, masa madre if you like the poetry of later tongues, to kickstart the next batch, long before packaged yeast made everyone feel like a magician. You pinch off a portion and smear it into the wet center, and the scent snugs closer, gentle and sour. It's the kind of smell that says, I know we look humble, but wait a few hours. You work in silence because silence makes the dough speak, not loudly, never loudly, but in textures and little shifts. At first, it resists chewing gum on a hot step. Then, somewhere around the sixth or eighth fold, it relaxes like a cat deciding your lap is acceptable. You feel gluten threads knitting under your palms, a hush-hush architecture rising without nails or plans. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers preferred a stiffer dough for scoring those famous spoke-like segments on their loaves, or a softer dough that yielded a wider bloom. You just know this batch wants a little more water and maybe a whisper of oil to keep it friendly. Someone slides you a small dish of salt and you sprinkle it like soft rain. The dough tightens immediately, shy but interested. You knead again, and time slows to baker's time, where minutes are measured not by clocks, but by the change from tacky to supple. A fine ghost of flour settles on your forearms. You remember the mill dust, how it made everyone look like statues caught mid-thought. Here, the dust blesses you again, and you grin, quietly, at the thought that you are halfway to becoming a marble relief of person who needs. A quirky tidbit emerges with a thump. Under the bench is a small box of Lucky Charms, a smooth river stone, a dried sprig of laurel, and, most mysteriously, a carved wooden fish with a crack down its spine. The baker taps the fish before every large batch. Maybe it's for luck, maybe it's for timing, or maybe he once promised the river that he'd never forget the sea's help in carrying grain to this table. You give the fish a polite tap too. It seems rude to break the ritual on a day when you're asking dough to behave. Joke number 1. If the bread rises especially well, you'll tell everyone it's the fish. If it sulks, obviously it's Mercury retrograde. Rest. You gather the dough into a smooth ball and let it sit beneath a damp cloth. The room's sounds magnify. Cloth whispering, clay ticking as it cools, a pigeon cooing outside with the persistence of a neighbor who borrowed your bowl and forgot to return it. You prod the dough after a moment the way you might test a cloud, gently, not really expecting an answer. It answers, a soft spring back, a tiny sigh. You miss coffee again, but settle for the aroma of warm flour and faint fermentation. Joke number 2. Roman mornings are a decaf lifestyle, whether you opted in or not. While the dough breathes, you mix a second, smaller batch for flatbreads. You add a little oil, olive, green as fresh leaves, and a pinch of dried herbs. The scent lifts, time maybe, and a memory of hillsides that donkeys know by heart. You rub your hands with oil to slick away the stickiness, a trick older than anyone in the room. The baker's apprentice nods in approval, and you pretend you knew it all along. You return to the first dough and fold it again, gently now, like tucking a child into a cool sheet. Each fold is a geography lesson, from the Nile Delta to your fingers, from stone mills to this pliant satiny globe. You listen for the change and it comes. The dough sighs, sits taller, keeps its shape. You shape it into a round, its skin smooth and lightly taut, then rest it seam side up in a wicker basket dusted with bran. The basket's weave leaves a faint imprint, a sleepy crosshatch of the day's patience. You cover it and let the room do what rooms do best, keep time without asking. In the windows dim, the apprentice scratches a tally onto a wax tablet. How many rounds, how many flats, how much flour remains. The tablet picks up flour smears that make the numbers look like they're waking from a dream. He mentions, almost offhand, the mainstream fact that commercial bakeries proliferated in Rome after the 1st century BCE, turning household labor into a citywide trade. You nod, thinking how the silence here is not absence but concentration, not emptiness but promise. You check the dough again. A gentle poke leaves a dimple that slowly eases back, the universal signal that the oven is now part of the conversation. You lift the round like a sleeping moon and set it aside for final proof. Another round follows, then another. The bench is a calendar, each loaf a day, rolling softly toward its heat. A jug of water sits at the ready for bassinage. You don't call it that, of course, but you do the practice. With wet fingers, you pat a skittish dough that wants to be stiffer than you do. It yields, barely. You coax kindly. You tell it a joke. Number 3, if you rise too fast, we'll call you a senator. The dough settles into good behavior, amused or merely hydrated. You glance at the leaven jar and consider adding a whisper more to the next batch. Historians still argue whether Roman leavens leaned more toward beer barn borrowed from brewers or purely sourdough cultures nurtured in bakeries. The surviving evidence points both ways, like a crossroads where the signposts have a sense of humor. Today, your jar is the sour, apple-breathing kind. It feels right, old, steady, a little stubborn. The apprentice brings a bowl of seeds, poppy, sesame, and something he calls the one that makes old men nod. You roll a small loaf across the seeds. They cling in polka dots that promise crunch. Another quirky touch. He presses a small stamp into a loaf's skin, a mark that identifies the bakery. It's both pride and regulation. If a loaf is underweight, the magistrate knows whose door to knock. You imagine the stamp like a tiny passport, proof that this dough has cleared every border from flour to flame. Silence holds, even as the oven room murmurs awake beyond the door. You cradle the final round and set it with the others. The bench clears to wood again, a pale arc of flour left like a shoreline after tide. You wash your hands in cool water that turns cloudy, watching the last threads of dough swirl and vanish. The quiet has done its work. The dough is alive, not dramatically, not in a movie score way, but with the modest confidence of something that knows heat is coming and is ready to expand without complaint. You open the door to the ovens and the quiet follows you like a cloak. Heat folds over your cheeks. The loaves wait in their baskets, eyes closed, sure of what happens next. You take a breath that tastes of yeast and wood smoke and step across the threshold, palms tingling with the slow thunder of a day that rises because you didn't rush it. The heat greets you like an old friend who doesn't believe in personal space. It wraps itself around your face, slides down your arms, and settles into your bones before you've even taken 2 steps into the oven room. The glow from the mouths of the ferns turns the space into a flickering cavern, walls dancing in amber light. You blink against the brightness, watching thin curls of smoke trace lazy patterns toward the rafters before escaping through the vents cut in the roof. Each oven is a domed clay belly, wide enough for a man to crawl halfway inside if he were foolish enough to try. The floors are lined with flat tiles, blackened at the edges from years of heat and ash. A baker crouches by one, testing the surface temperature, not with a thermometer, those don't exist yet, but with a palm held just above the floor. Mainstream fact, Roman bakers gauged oven readiness by feel and by how quickly a pinch of flour would scorch on the tiles. If it burned in seconds, they knew it was too hot for bread and better suited for the thin, cracker-like lagana. To the side, the firemaster feeds the flames with bundles of olive wood. The scent is rich and slightly sweet, unlike the sharper tang of pine. You watch the fire leap and settle, in the rhythm of a living thing that has learned patience. Historians still argue whether certain bakeries preferred to bake entirely in retained heat, raking out the coals before loading the loaves, or whether some kept a small flame alive during baking for a steadier warmth. Here they do the former, and you watch as the baker sweeps the embers to the side with a long-handled brush, the metal bristles scratching like distant cicadas. The shaped loaves wait in neat rows on wooden boards. Their pale surfaces are scored into segments, 8 wedges meeting in the center like a wheel of soft cheese. The cuts aren't just decoration, they make the bread easier to tear apart later. A quirky tidbit, these scoring patterns also acted as a kind of branding. The same way a modern coffee cup might have a logo, the marks told you which bakery made your loaf in case you wanted to buy from them again or complain about it at the forum. One by one, the loaves are slid into the oven on long paddles, their bottoms whispering against the hot tile. The baker moves without hurry because this is a job ruined by haste. You notice how he slightly mists each paddle with water before loading, the droplets hissing when they meet the oven floor, partly to create steam, partly to keep the dough from sticking. Joke number 1 for the day. If you don't hear that hiss, the bread is basically just squatting in there waiting to embarrass you. You stand back, letting the heat wrap your legs, and breathe in the aroma as it begins to shift. First, it's the grassy scent of raw dough. Then slowly it deepens into roasted grain and warm crust, the smell tightening your stomach with anticipation. Outside the bakery, you know people are already queuing, following their noses like cats after a fish cart. The firemaster checks the color of the oven tiles, nods to himself, and shuts the door with a slab of wood. The world inside is now entirely scent and time. You lean against the wall, your tunic sticking slightly to your back, and listen to the faint pops and cracks of crust forming, tiny earthquakes in miniature loaves. A boy rushes in from the front room with a small tray of flatbreads for the soldiers' breakfast. These are baked faster at the hotter edges of the oven. He sprinkles them with coarse salt, and a few seeds stick to the sheen of oil brushed on before baking. You snag one, at the baker's nod, of course, and bite in. The edges shatter crisply, giving way to a tender middle. It's not coffee, but it's enough to make you forget you ever missed it. Joke number 2. If modern brunch existed here, this flatbread would come with a 6-hour line and someone explaining why it's authentically ancient. The first round of loaves is ready. The baker slides them out, and the color stops you mid-thought. Deep golden brown with darker freckles where the heat kissed them hardest. Steam escapes from the scored lines, carrying a smell that makes the apprentice grin like he's hearing his favorite song. He taps the bottom of a loaf, listening for the hollow sound that says it's done. You try it too, the crust hot against your palm, and the hollow thump answers like a drum. These loaves cool on racks in the open air, and you notice how their aroma drifts straight out to the street. The breeze carries it into doorways, over market stalls, into the folds of passing cloaks. The bakery isn't just making bread, it's marketing without realizing it. The next batch slides in, another set cools, the room falls into a steady rhythm, load, bake, unload, cool. The heat never leaves, but it becomes part of you, a second heartbeat that keeps time with the oven. Historians still argue whether the Romans baked more for immediate sale or for storage. Looking at this pace, you suspect the answer is simply yes. A final quirky moment. In one corner, the apprentice scratches a tally into the wall, not of sales, but of perfect bakes. It's an unspoken competition between him and the head baker. Today's tally gets one more mark, and you suspect he'll remember it for the rest of the week. Joke number 3, you're tempted to add your own mark, but given your 0% contribution to actually baking, it would be like signing your name to the Colosseum because you clapped at a gladiator match. The day outside is warming now, sunlight filtering into the oven room through the high vent. The firemaster brushes ash from his tunic, the baker wipes his paddle clean, and you find yourself reluctant to step back into the street. Here, time moves in gentle circles, not marching forward. You watch another loaf emerge, steam swirling up into the beams, and think that maybe this is how history should smell, warm, patient, and entirely sure of itself. The bakery's doorway frames a slice of bright street, but you step sideways instead of out, following the narrow alley that leads toward the barracks. The loaves cool in your arms, wrapped in a square of coarse cloth, their warmth seeping through to your skin. Outside, the air is sharper, carrying the sounds of metal on metal, someone sharpening a gladius, and the bray of a mule in the stables. The barracks yard is busy in that unhurried military way. Soldiers lean against walls, mending straps, oiling armor, or simply sitting in patches of sun. You pass through the gate, nodding to a sentry who eyes the bread like a wolf eyes a lamb. Mainstream fact. The Roman legions marched with bread as a staple ration, sometimes carrying unbaked dough to cook in camp ovens or under the embers of a fire pit. Here, the loaves are already baked, a luxury afforded to troops stationed in the city. A centurion waves you over. His helmet rests on a bench, leaving his hair flattened like wet reeds. He takes a loaf, testing its weight, then tears it cleanly in half without a knife. Steam rises and the soft crumb yields with a quiet sigh. He hands you a piece, and you bite into the chewy center, less refined than a patrician's loaf, but hearty, the kind that sits well in a stomach for hours. Nearby, a soldier grins as he uses his crust to mop up a clay bowl of lentils. He says, "This bread could march itself to Gaul," and you think he might mean it. Historians still argue whether legion bread was intentionally dense to last longer or simply ended up that way because soldiers preferred flour that was less refined and more filling. The debate doesn't matter to the men here. What matters is that it's warm and plentiful. A mule handler strolls past with saddlebags, each stuffed with flatbreads for a supply run. The smell trails him like a polite ghost. You follow him into the supply tent, where rations are laid out in neat rows: bread, dried fruit, salted pork, and amphorae of watered wine. The quartermaster makes a note in his wax tablet for each loaf distributed. There's a quiet pride in the act, as though bread is more than food. It's an unspoken promise that the army will keep moving. A quirky tidbit comes from an older soldier leaning on his spear. He swears by baking his ration loaf under his shield on hot days. He says the sun bakes it just enough to make it smug, which you interpret as a crust that cracks but doesn't shatter. You imagine a row of shields propped in the midday sun, each hiding a loaf inside, and try not to laugh at the image. Joke number 1. If Caesar ever inspected the troops during one of those makeshift baking sessions, the official story would be training exercises. You sit with a small group as they break their bread and talk in low tones about postings, the weather, and rumors from the northern front. One man rubs garlic across his crust, the smell blooming sharp in the warm air. Another dips his in oil from a dented tin, sighing as if he's just been paid double. Bread here is not an accessory to the meal. It is the meal, the bowl, and the utensil all at once. The centurion shares the story about a campaign in the east where a loaf was baked in sand, covered with hot stones, and forgotten until nightfall. When they dug it up, it was dense and smoky, like eating the desert, he says, grinning. Historians still argue whether such field improvisations influenced any lasting recipes, but you suspect those loaves were too tied to place and moment to become a city staple. Joke number 2 surfaces when a young recruit complains about his loaf being too small. The centurion deadpans, "That's because you're only half a soldier so far," and the whole group laughs, not unkindly. You think about the way humor here, even when sharp, is part of the glue that binds them. As the morning wears on, the bread dwindles. Soldiers tuck their portions into leather pouches, tie them with string, and sling them over shoulders for patrol. One man carefully wraps a loaf in an old scarf, explaining that it's for his mother. He'll bring it to her on his day off, a taste of the barracks she'll never step into. You stand, brushing crumbs from your tunic, and take one last look around. The barracks has its own rhythm, slower than the oven's heat, but just as steady. Bread is at the center of it, both fuel and comfort. You step back toward the street, the smell of the loaves now mingled with oil, leather, and the faint tang of iron. On the way out, the sentry catches your eye and nods toward your now empty cloth. "Come back tomorrow," he says. "We'll trade stories for a crust." Joke number 3, you think about showing up with an entire basket just to see if the whole legion would stand down for snack time. You leave through this gate, turning toward the market where other hands will claim their share of the day's baking. The clatter of shields fades behind you, replaced by the distant call of a fishmonger and the hum of a city that runs, quietly and without announcement, on bread. You follow the smell of flour and smoke away from the barracks, down a side street where the buildings lean together like old friends sharing gossip. At the far end, a carved wooden sign sways over a heavy oak door, 2 crossed paddles, worn smooth by years of sun and rain. This is the meeting place of the Bakers' Guild, the quiet council of men and women who, in their own way, hold the city's stomach in their hands. Inside, the air is warm but not oven hot, thick with the scent of bread cooled hours ago. Low benches line the walls, their surfaces scarred with knife marks, flour dust, and the occasional mysterious burn. A wide table dominates the center, covered not in loaves but in clay cups of watered wine, a small plate of olives, and a stack of wax tablets. The guildmaster, a broad man with forearms like tree roots, is speaking in a voice that never rises above conversational, yet every ear is tuned to him. Mainstream fact: Roman bakers' guilds, Collegia Pastorum, were recognized institutions with official rules, elected officers, and even a degree of political influence, especially when bread supply was at stake. You take a seat along the wall as the conversation flows, from flour prices to wood shortages, from the cost of donkey feed to the grain shipments delayed at Ostia. Every problem has the same underlying truth: no grain, no bread, no peace. The guild keeps meticulous records. Marks on wax tablets for loaves baked, fines collected, and even disputes settled. Today, one such dispute takes center stage. A baker's accused of using ghost flour, stretching his dough with ground beans to save on wheat. The baker defends himself, saying he only did it when the last shipment ran late. Historians still argue whether such substitutions were common enough to be an accepted wartime or famine practice, but here, the verdict seems to hinge less on history and more on whether anyone got stomach trouble afterward. A quirky detail catches your eye. Above the guild table hangs a row of wooden bread stamps, each carved with a unique pattern. These stamps, pressed into dough before baking, serve both as branding and as a way to mark loaves meant for special customers: senators, temples, or even the emperor's kitchen. One has a design of a dolphin curled around a sheaf of wheat, another a pair of clasped hands. You imagine how each loaf carried a quiet signature into the city, a baker's handshake in crust form. The meeting shifts to lighter topics. A young baker jokes about a customer who tried to haggle by claiming his loaf was haunted and made the family cat yowl all night. Joke number 1, the guildmaster replies, deadpan, Did the cat complain in writing, prompting a ripple of laughter around the table? You notice the apprentices sitting along the back wall, listening closely. They're here not just to learn bread making, but to understand the network, the unspoken agreements about prices, the seasonal rhythms of grain supply, the alliances with millers, porters, and even lamp oil merchants. One apprentice scribbles notes onto a scrap of parchment, occasionally glancing at you as if wondering if you're part of this world or just passing through. A round of wine is poured, and the conversation drifts toward the upcoming festival. The guild will bake a massive ceremonial loaf for the opening feast, studded with dried fruit and perfumed with honey. Mainstream fact, such festival loaves were sometimes paraded through the streets before being divided, a spectacle of abundance meant to reassure the populace. Here, the debate is over whose oven will handle the job, since not all ovens can take a loaf the size of a shield. In a quieter corner, you overhear two older bakers talking about bread prices during the last famine. They speak in low voices, remembering how the guild had to choose between raising prices or cutting loaf sizes. Historians still argue which decision was more common in Rome's history, though the resigned tone in their voices suggests both happened often enough to leave a mark. Joke number 2 comes when someone complains about customers insisting their bread be baked lighter. The guildmaster mutters, "Then they should take it for a walk before eating," and the room bursts into chuckles. The business winds down. A clerk rolls up the wax tablets and places them in a small chest with a brass lock, while an apprentice sweeps the floor, catching stray crumbs in a wicker pan. The stamps are hung back on their pegs, their shadows stretching across the wall in the golden light from a small oil lamp. Before you leave, a baker with a voice like gravel presses a small loaf into your hand. "For the road," he says, as though you've done some great service simply by sitting here and listening. You thank him, feeling the soft give of the crust under your fingers. Joke number 3, you think about telling him you'll report back to the international bread authorities about the fine state of Roman loaves, but decide to keep that one to yourself. Stepping back into the street, you bite into the loaf while it's still warm. The crust crackles, the crumb is soft, and the taste carries a hint of olives from the air inside that room. You walk on, the weight of the guild's quiet power lingering with each chew, knowing that the bread in your hand is more than just food. It's a small piece of the city's order, wrapped in flour and patience. You ease into the market as the morning opens like a fan, slow, rib by rib, until the whole square breathes. From the first step, it's a chorus of small sounds. Wicker creaking under stacked loaves, knives nicking olives into neat piles, a hawker's voice sliding up in price and down in promise. You drift between stalls where bread is the main event and everything else is a supporting actor. Honey in clay pots, soft cheeses sweating in the sun, amphorae of oil shining like bottled dawn. Round loaves sit in pyramids, each scored wheel glinting with a feathering of bran. You run a finger along a crust and feel where heat has freckled it darker, as if the oven gave the loaf a kiss it meant to keep. A woman plucks one from the middle of a stack with the deftness of someone who's been dodging small avalanches all her life. She stamps it with a wooden block, the same dolphin and wheat you saw at the guild, then hands it across the counter with a weighing glance for good measure. Mainstream fact, weights and measures are no trifling matter here. Magistrates patrol the market, and a baker caught using false scales can be fined, shamed, or worse, shut for a stretch that no one can afford. The air smells like decisions. If you turn left, there are flatbreads blistered at the edges, still snappish from the oven. If you turn right, there's a stall that specializes in yesterday's loaves, sold at a discount and turned into genius with a soak of milk, a drizzle of oil, or a long swim in stew. Historians still argue whether most Romans bought fresh bread daily or made do with day-old loaves more often than they admitted. Listening to the bargaining around you, it sounds like the truth changes with the purse. A boy threads past wearing a string of ring breads over his shoulder, each one golden and firm, like edible bangles. He calls out the price, then sweetens the deal with a wink. "Buy 2 and I'll throw in the string." Joke number 1 arrives on cue. You imagine modern influencers trying that line and starting a micro-trend called carbohydrate jewelry. You nearly buy one just to wear it for 5 steps and pretend you invented the look. You stop at a table where a baker trims the ragged edges from a tray of lagana. Thin sheets baked crisp, then brushed with oil. He scatters thyme over the top with fingers that never hurry. A man beside him demonstrates the fold for travel. Snap, stack, wrap. Your mouth learns the crackle before your teeth do, and a sliver dissolves on your tongue like a polite secret. The baker tells you the oven had been too hot for loaves earlier, so he used the heat's impatience to make flatbread first. You nod as if you also rearrange your life around clay domes and coals. At the next stall, a girl ladles warm milk over hunks of stale bread, finishing with a ribbon of honey. She calls it breakfast, but you taste afternoon comfort, the kind that quiets weather and worry. A quirky tidbit comes with her grin. She swears the honey she uses is from hives kept on a city rooftop near the circus, where the bees cheer for the chariots and make faster honey on race days. It's nonsense and adorable, and you decide to believe it until proven otherwise. You pass a vendor selling soldiers' favorites, hardtack discs, buxolatum built to last. He threads them onto cords by the dozen, then drapes them like garlands across a pole. He raps one with his knuckle. It answers like a small door. He insists they're perfect, softened in wine or tucked into a stew where they pretend to be dumplings. Your jaw twinges in sympathy. Joke number 2, he offers to throw one in for free if you promise not to sue for dental damages, and you nearly take the deal. The market's center boasts a shade awning where a magistrate stations himself, an orderly presence amid the bustle. A pair of assistants test scales with little bronze weights shaped like ducks and acorns. You watch them measure a loaf, adjust the balance, and make a neat notch in a wax tablet. The vendor's smile looks the way bread smells when it's a minute past done. Tight, a little brittle, hoping to relax. You remember the guild stamps and think about how many small, quiet systems keep a city from tipping into hunger or uproar. Someone smears garlic over a crust and offers you a bite. The heat of it opens your head like a window. Another hand presents a dish of olive paste, the color of lizards after rain. You dip a torn corner, and the flavor swings between bitter and velvety, landing on comfort. A woman to your left insists sesame seeds keep pigeons from stealing bread. She flicks a few onto a bench to demonstrate. The pigeon ignores them and aims for your crumb instead. Historians still argue whether ancient city birds were bolder than the modern kind, but this one looks like it's read the law and decided it doesn't apply. Past a fruit seller, you find a little curiosity table. Bread charms, palm-sized terracotta tokens molded like tiny loaves. The vendor says they're given to children at festivals or tucked into kitchen niches to remind the dough to rise. A fringe of superstition drapes the market as easily as the awnings. Salt over thresholds, 3 knocks on the oven door for luck, and quiet tapping on the wooden fish you met earlier, which suddenly feels less like an oddity and more like a citywide whisper. In a shaded lane, an older man demonstrates crumb sifting. He rubs yesterday's bread through a coarse sieve to make big, soft crumbs, then through a finer one to make sand-like sprinkles. He dries both in a shallow pan over coals and calls them his snow. He sprinkles the coarse snow over stewed greens, the fine over fried fish, and beams like he invented texture. You suspect he may not have, but you also suspect he's better at it than most. A chorus rises near the fountain where vendors debate today's prices. One says the grain from Ostia is late again. Another counters that the mills have been generous with their tolls this week. You picture the donkey at the mill, steady as ever, utterly indifferent to market chatter. A baker shrugs and says he'll cut a fig into each loaf at no extra charge. The crowd approves because a gift is a gift even when it doubles as marketing. Joke number 3. Someone quips that the figs will add digestive diplomacy, and no one argues with the promise of quiet stomachs. You wander toward the outer ring of stalls, where the smells get stranger and better. Rosemary smoke, hot brass from a pan, wine laughing in cups. A woman slices a loaf horizontally, hollows it slightly, then fills it with cheese and herbs before setting the lid back on. She presses it under a warm stone for a minute, lifts it, and hands it over. The crust sighs as you bite, and the herbs grin through the cheese. She doesn't call it a sandwich, but you do, in the privacy of your mind. Then refrain from founding a food empire on the spot. As you circle back, you notice the loaves wearing the day's progress. Early ones look proud, late ones look grateful, and the last few sit like they're pretending not to be the last few. A boy sweeps crumbs into a pan the way you'd gather seashells, careful, pleased, knowing each one is a small memory of bread. Somewhere behind you, a vendor calls for more change, another calls for a break, and a third calls for the person who promised to come back and hasn't. The market doesn't mind. It flexes, adjusts, keeps breathing. You lean against a sun-warmed column, breaking off another piece of crust. The square is a lazy planet with bread at the center and everyone else happily in orbit. You look toward the streets feeding into the market and think of the routes you followed: river, mill, bench, oven, barracks, guild, and now this, the place where everything meets the ordinary miracle of a meal. The morning folds itself away as the awnings are drawn lower against the noonday glare, and you carry on, crumbs at your lips, hands smelling of thyme and warm grain, ready to follow the next quiet turn of the city's appetite. You drift out of the market's bright hum into streets threaded with ribbons of colored cloth, their ends fluttering between buildings like lazy flags. The air changes here, less of the sharp garlic and salt from market stalls, more of the soft sweetness of spices and roasting meat. You know you're heading toward a festival because even the paving stones seem to have been swept with extra care, and the sound of music swells as you turn the next corner. It's Saturnalia, the city's most beloved chaos. In place of the usual bustle, the street carries a gentle, tipsy rhythm, laughter layered over the jingling of bells stitched into tunics, the shuffle of sandals keeping time with the music from a reed flute somewhere nearby. You pass garlands of pine and laurel, their scent mingling with something warmer, richer. Then you see it, a stall under an awning of green cloth, piled high with the festival's crown jewel, sweetened bread. Mainstream fact: Roman festival loaves could be enriched with honey, dried fruit, spices like cinnamon or anise, and even flecks of ground nuts, a rare luxury in everyday bread. Here, the baker is shaping a batch into thick braids, brushing them with oil before sprinkling crushed almonds on top. The air smells like a memory you haven't had yet. A boy darts past carrying a round loaf so heavy with figs it looks as though it might slump under its own abundance. His friend chases him, not to take the loaf, but to catch the scent trailing behind like perfume. Historians still argue whether festival breads were shared equally or reserved for certain social ranks. Judging by the sheer number of hands reaching for these loaves, the modern answer here is first come, first served. You queue behind a pair of women debating the merits of sweet wine versus watered wine for dunking bread. One insists that the spices bloom better in the sweeter drink, the other claims it overpowers the figs. You consider offering to test both theories purely in the name of scholarship. Joke number 1, you picture yourself as official Roman bread dunking inspector and wonder what the pay rate would be. When it's your turn, the baker offers you a slice warm enough to steam the cool air. The crust is thin, glazed with honey so it gleams in the sunlight. Inside, the crumb is soft, studded with currants that burst like tiny fireworks of sugar. You chew slowly, aware of the faint crackle where honey has pooled and baked into the crust. This is not a bread for marching or storing. This is bread for stopping everything else. Nearby, a troupe of performers juggles loaves like props, passing them from hand to hand while the crowd cheers. One juggler pretends to drop a loaf, only to reveal a smaller one hidden inside. The laughter rises like the scent from the stalls, a quirky tidbit from a nearby storyteller. Some festival loaves were intentionally baked with small trinkets inside, nuts, coins, even carved charms, meant to surprise whoever found them. The practice, she says, is lucky unless you bite down too hard on a denarius. Children weave through the crowd with baskets of smaller, bite-sized sweet rolls, selling them for a few copper coins. You buy one, the sugar sticking to your fingertips, and watch as a group of older men plays dice at a table, their bread set to one side as though even luck takes a break for a good loaf. Historians still argue if Saturnalia's feasting traditions truly reversed social roles for the day, or if it was more symbolic. But here in the glow of bread and wine, it's easy to believe the city bends a little toward joy. Joke number 2 comes when a tipsy reveler offers to trade you his laurel wreath for your roll, claiming yours is more regal. You politely decline, but imagine the look on the baker's face if you returned wearing it like a crown. You move toward the central square where a ceremonial loaf sits on display. It's enormous, nearly the size of a chariot wheel, and decorated with patterns of braided dough, leaves, and flowers. This one isn't for eating, at least not yet. It will be paraded through the streets before being cut and shared at the evening feast. The baker responsible stands nearby, soaking in the admiration like yeast in warm water. The parade begins slowly, the loaf carried on a wooden board by 4 men, each stepping in time with the drum beats ahead. People toss flowers, ribbons, and occasionally coins toward the loaf, which land with soft thuds on its golden crust. Children run alongside, holding their own miniature braided breads as if to show solidarity. A woman near you murmurs that this tradition keeps the city bound by crumbs, and you think she might be right. By mid-afternoon, the sweet loaves have dwindled. Vendors wrap the last few in linen for those taking them home, the cloth tied with colored twine that will later be saved for good luck. The air is thick with the perfume of warm honey, mingled now with the sharper tang of mulled wine simmering in great bronze pots. Joke number 3, you imagine the mulled wine vendors joining forces with the bakers, creating a bread and wine stall that would either solve the city's every problem or cause a small, happy riot. As the crowd shifts toward music and dancing, you step back to the edge of the square. The last rays of sun catch the ceremonial loaf as it turns a corner, disappearing toward the banquet hall. You follow at a distance, letting the sweet scent guide you, thinking of how bread, humble, daily, practical, has, for this one day, put on a robe of honey and stepped into the role of festival king. The festival music fades behind you as you follow a quieter street toward the Aventine, where the smell of baking changes. It's less perfumed here, no figs, no honey glaze, just the honest, sturdy aroma of plain loaves cooling on wooden racks. Ahead, a crowd gathers in a long, orderly line that snakes along the colonnade. No bargaining, no hawkers calling out prices. These loaves aren't bought, they're given. You've arrived at the Annona distribution, the state's grain dole turned into bread for the city's poorest citizens. Mainstream fact. By the late Republic and into the Empire, Rome provided free or subsidized grain and later bread to eligible citizens, a policy aimed as much at preventing unrest as it was at feeding the hungry. Here, the policy is a lifeline, bread as daily stability in a city whose fortunes rise and fall like the tide. A scribe with a wax tablet sits at the entrance, checking names as each person steps forward. They present small wooden tokens stamped with identifying marks. The scribe nods, scratches a line into the tablet, and waves them onward. Behind him, workers pull fresh loaves from a low, wide oven, setting them on racks to steam gently in the morning air. The bread is plain but plentiful, round loaves with deep scores for easy tearing. Historians still argue whether these dole loaves were baked centrally in government-run bakeries or contracted out to private guild members. Judging from the flour-dusted tunics here, you suspect the latter, guild bakers working under state orders. Each loaf is nearly identical in weight, size, and scoring, as if shaped by a single set of hands. You stand off to the side, watching the rhythm of the line. An elderly woman tucks her loaf into a cloth bag, already patched and repatched. A young boy carries his loaf like a treasure, holding it with both hands. A man with a limp rests his loaf on his shoulder to free his cane. No one lingers. They collect their share and melt back into the streets, vanishing like steam into the city's alleys. A quirky tidbit drifts your way from one of the bakers. Apparently, some people in line bring small jars of oil or vinegar to drizzle over their bread before they even leave the square. It's a habit he admires, calling it making dignity out of ration. You imagine a dozen quiet corners across the city where a loaf is halved, dipped, and eaten with deliberate care. Joke number 1 comes when a boy near the back of the line peers into the rack and asks, "Do you have any shaped like lions?" The baker laughs and says, "Only if they roar when you bite them." The boy grins, clearly satisfied with the answer. At the far end of this colonnade, a secondary table distributes yesterday's loaves to those who arrive too late for fresh bread. These loaves are firmer, their crusts darker, but they're handed over with the same measured dignity. One woman slices hers into thin pieces right there, offering a portion to a stranger before tucking the rest into her bag. You notice the magistrate overseeing the operation standing apart but alert. His presence is more symbolic than managerial. The real work hums without his intervention. Still, when a dispute arises, a man claiming his name was skipped, the magistrate steps forward, listens, and resolves it with a loaf from his own personal basket. Historians still argue whether such gestures were genuine acts of charity or calculated shows of benevolence, but in this moment the man walks away fed, and that seems to be the point. A breeze picks up, carrying the scent of baking further down the street. Passers-by glance toward the colonnade, some slowing to watch, others walking faster to avoid the quiet reminder of their own empty tables. The bakers move steadily, loading fresh loaves onto the racks as fast as they cool enough to handle. Joke number 2, one of the younger bakers, sweat beading on his forehead, mutters to a coworker that if the state ever starts doling out wine the way it does bread, they'll have to build a second colonnade. The coworker snorts, nearly dropping his loaf in agreement. In a shaded corner, you find a group of children sitting cross-legged, sharing a single loaf. They break it into uneven pieces but make sure everyone gets a share, even the smallest girl, whose piece is little more than a crust. She nibbles it happily, swinging her feet against the marble step. You move slowly along the line until you reach the oven itself. The fire glows low, just enough to keep the tiles hot without scorching the crust. A baker slides a paddle beneath a loaf and tilts it toward you. Steam curls up in lazy tendrils, carrying that same humble aroma you've known since dawn. Flour, water, heat, and patience. You take the loaf when offered, its weight solid in your hands. It's not sweet, not perfumed with herbs, but there's a kind of quiet generosity in its simplicity. Joke number 3 is whispered by the scribe as you pass. Careful. If you carry that too long, you might qualify as public transport. You laugh under your breath and keep walking. You leave the colonnade with the loaf under your arm, feeling the way its warmth seeps into you even through the cloth. This bread isn't a luxury or a festival centerpiece. It's the city's heartbeat in edible form, keeping the streets from turning restless, one slow, even beat at a time. As you turn toward the next street, you can still hear the scrape of the paddle on tile and the murmur of the line, each sound an unbroken promise that tomorrow they'll be here again. You turn from the colonnade into a narrow lane that smells faintly of rosemary and sun-warmed clay. The street is quieter here, but not still. There's the muted knock of a pestle in a mortar somewhere above, the flap of laundry in the breeze, and most enticingly, a thread of scent winding from a small doorway up ahead. It's bread again, but not the plain rations you just left behind. This bread carries whispers of gardens and spice jars, of experiments tucked between tradition's steady pages. Inside the shop, loaves sit cooling on a long, low shelf, each one wearing a different crown, some sprinkled with coarse salt, others freckled with sesame, a few glistening where honey has pooled in the scoring. The baker here clearly enjoys a little mischief. Mainstream fact, though most Roman bread was simple, flavored varieties existed, infused with herbs like dill or coriander, enriched with milk or sweetened with honey and dried fruit. These special loaves often appeared at private dinners or were commissioned for important guests. The baker, a wiry man with laugh lines and forearms dusted in flour, sees you eyeing a loaf studded with green herbs. Rosemary and bay, he says, keeps the bread from forgetting the hills. He slices off a piece, and the steam carries a sharp, clean scent that makes you think of hillside paths and the crunch of gravel underfoot. You bite in. The crumb is soft but anchored by the resinous bite of the herbs. It tastes like someone told a story about the countryside, and the bread believed every word. Historians still argue whether certain herbs were added purely for flavor or for supposed health benefits, but here the effect is mostly joy. A woman at the counter orders a loaf with crushed garlic kneaded in, saying it will keep her husband from hogging the bed with his snoring. Joke number 1, the baker doesn't miss a beat. Or from hogging the bread, he says, and they both laugh as if it's a known risk. In one corner, a small table holds bowls of garnishes, poppy seeds, crushed walnuts, a mixture of pepper and cumin. Customers can request a handful pressed into the crust before baking. A young man orders his loaf with the works, and the baker obliges, rolling it across each bowl until it looks like a festival in miniature. You wonder how many of these loaves end up as gifts, edible tokens of affection that last just long enough to be eaten in one sitting. A quirky tidbit emerges when the baker shows you a jar of preserved dates, dark and glossy in syrup. He says he sometimes chops them fine and folds them into the dough along with almond meal. The result is a loaf that needs nothing else, no oil, no cheese, just a knife and a quiet corner to enjoy it. He winks, adding that he hides a small jar of the syrup for himself behind the flour sack, so you imagine him sneaking a spoonful on long afternoons when the ovens are cooling. You watch as an apprentice shapes small rolls for the midday rush. Each is pinched into a tight ball, rolled smooth, then tapped gently in the center to create a shallow dimple. The baker sprinkles herbs into each, so they don't feel lonely, he says. Joke number 2, you remark that the dimples look like they're waiting to hold soup, and the apprentice replies, only if the soup promises not to drown. On a side shelf, wrapped in linen, is a darker loaf made from barley flour. Its crust is thicker, the crumb denser, and the baker explains it's for a client who likes bread that bites back. Barley was cheaper than wheat and often associated with the diets of soldiers or the poor, yet here it's treated as a deliberate choice, a reminder that taste is sometimes a matter of perspective. The shop door opens and closes with a steady rhythm as customers come and go. One man buys a loaf spiced with fennel seeds, claiming it helps with digestion after heavy meals. A woman chooses a small round brushed with olive oil and dusted in sea salt, tucking it into a cloth as though she's packing a secret. A boy leaves clutching 2 honey rolls, licking his fingers before he's even stepped outside. Historians still argue whether the more elaborate flavored loaves were a mark of wealth or simply a baker's way of standing out in a crowded market. Here, in this tiny shop, it feels less about class and more about curiosity, each loaf a small adventure in crust and crumb. The baker slides a new batch into the oven, the scent of toasting seeds rising immediately. You lean against the counter, savoring the mingling smells, rosemary's brightness, honey's mellow warmth, the faint, peppery edge of cumin. These loaves won't last the hour. You can feel it in the way customers glance toward the oven, already planning their return. Joke number 3 arrives as the baker hands you a small paper packet, inside 2 rolls brushed with oil and sprinkled with thyme. For the road, he says, but eat them before you get home, or the road will get jealous. You promise nothing, knowing full well they'll be gone before the next street corner. You step back into the sun, the packet warm in your hand, the scent trailing after you. Somewhere down the lane, another baker is shaping another experiment, and you realize the city's bread is as varied as its people, plain when it needs to be, daring when it wants to be, always ready to feed whoever walks through the door. You follow the richer scent of wood smoke and warm marble up a hill toward the Palatine, where the streets grow wider and quieter. Here, the hum of the marketplace fades into the measured footfalls of servants and the faint clink of amphorae being carried between courtyards. The air feels heavier, perfumed with herbs and roasting meats drifting from kitchens hidden behind high walls. And then you hear it, a low, steady crackle that could only be an oven working at full devotion. You've reached one of the imperial kitchens. Mainstream fact, the palaces of emperors and high-ranking officials often housed their own sprawling bakeries, staffed by dozens of slaves and freedmen who baked everything from the daily household bread to elaborate loaves for feasts. Bread here isn't just nourishment, it's part of the theater of power. You slip into the service courtyard, unnoticed amid the bustle. Long tables hold ranks of cooling bread, each loaf perfectly scored, some brushed with a glaze of egg for extra sheen. The shapes vary, round wheels for slicing, long, slender loaves for toasting, and even intricate knots of dough baked until they hold their curls. You watch a servant carry a tray toward an inner room, where the scent of roast lamb and stewed figs waits to greet it. The chief baker, a tall man with a tunic far too clean for someone working near flour, directs the staff with clipped gestures. You realize his hands are spotless because he rarely needs any more. His job is orchestration. He inspects each loaf before it leaves the kitchen, turning it over in his palm, tapping the base, even sniffing it like a jeweler examining a gem. Historians still argue whether emperors had personal preferences for certain breads, or if variety itself was the luxury they craved. In one corner, a pair of bakers works on decorative loaves. They braid ropes of dough, twist them into shapes, birds with wings outstretched, a fish with scales scored by the tip of a knife, a sheaf of wheat tied in dough ribbon. These loaves will be set on the banquet tables not for eating but as edible art, a quirky tidbit from a nearby servant. Sometimes these showpieces are hollow, baked around small surprises like nuts or dried fruit that tumble out when broken. It's to make the guests laugh, he says, or to distract them if the speeches run long. You drift closer to the ovens, which are grander than any you've seen so far. Their wide mouths glow orange, the heat strong enough to make you take a step back. The fire master uses a paddle nearly twice his height, sliding it in with slow precision. A tray of small rolls comes out, steam curling around their golden crusts. They are brushed with oil and sprinkled with salt before they've even cooled. One baker leans over to whisper, "These are for the emperor's breakfast. Soft inside, crisp at the edge." Joke number 1 appears as another baker winks at you. Don't touch those unless you want to be tomorrow's entertainment in the arena. You make a mental note to admire them from a safe, respectful distance. On a marble counter, a younger baker is experimenting. He sprinkles crushed coriander and sesame seeds over a flat round, then uses the blunt end of a spoon to make a pattern of small dimples across the top. When you ask, he says it helps the bread bake evenly and hold its topping, an old trick from his grandmother in Antioch. The scent, when it emerges from the oven, is a warm handshake between Rome and the East. Historians still argue how much of Rome's bread culture was shaped by the provinces it absorbed. In this kitchen, the answer seems to be quite a lot. Servants come and go, collecting loaves to deliver to different parts of the household. Some go to the emperor's table, others to guests, others to the army of staff who keep the palace humming. Even here, hierarchy is in the bread. Finer flour for the elite, coarser for the workers, but all baked to a standard that reflects the prestige of the house. You notice a small alcove where a lone baker works quietly, shaping a single loaf unlike the others. It's simple, made from coarse grain, and marked only with a single crosshatch on top. The baker tells you it's for an old nursemaid who has served the family for decades. She prefers the bread she grew up with in the countryside, and he smiles faintly, saying, "She says the fine flour tastes too proud." Joke number 2, you murmur, "At least the bread doesn't bow when she enters the room," and he chuckles without looking up from his work. As the morning rolls toward midday, the ovens are at full tilt. Bread comes out in waves, the smell filling the courtyard until you think it could roll down the hill and find its way into the city below. Decorative loaves are carried off to be arranged beside platters of meat and bowls of fruit. Trays of rolls are covered with linen to stay warm for the emperor's table. The chief baker surveys it all with the satisfaction of a general inspecting a well-ordered legion. Joke number 3 arrives when a harried servant rushes in, demanding, "Where is the loaf shaped like Neptune?" The chief baker deadpans, "Swimming in the fountain," before pointing to a tray in the corner. You step back out into the street, the air outside cooler but tinged with the lingering scent of rosemary, sesame, and wood smoke. The palace kitchens shrink behind you, but the image stays, the gleaming marble counters, the fire-bright ovens, the loaves that are both food and spectacle. Here, bread isn't just eaten, it's staged, dressed, and sent out like a well-rehearsed actor playing its part in the grand drama of Rome. You leave the marble echo of the imperial kitchens behind, trading polished corridors for the dusty breath of the countryside. The road narrows into a rutted path, shaded here and there by olive trees whose silver leaves clatter softly in the breeze. Beyond them stretch fields of wheat and barley, the stalks rustling like quiet applause. The smell here is simpler, sun-warmed grain, crushed grass, a hint of smoke from some unseen hearth. You reach a small farming village where bread begins and ends within sight of the same horizon. Mainstream fact, while the city's bread often came from guild bakeries or centralized ovens, rural Romans baked in open-air clay or brick pits, their loaves tailored to local grain, fuel, and tradition. The bread here has never seen marble counters or imperial stamps. It's the taste of a place distilled in flour and fire. A woman waves you toward a low, rounded oven built into the side of a stone wall. It's little more than a clay dome blackened with years of smoke, but it radiates a steady, welcoming heat. Beside it, a wooden bench holds dough rounds resting under linen, each dusted with flour like a late snowfall. She lifts a cloth to show you the smooth, pale skin of a loaf just ready for baking. "From our own wheat," she says, pride softening her voice. Historians still argue whether rural ovens were shared by the whole community or kept for individual households. Here, it seems to be both, families tending their own loaves but taking turns with the oven, each helping to feed the fire that will serve them all. The woman shapes her dough with practiced hands, pressing in herbs from a clay pot, oregano, wild fennel, maybe a sprig of thyme. She places the loaf on a wooden peel, slides it into the oven, and closes the opening with a flat stone. A quirky tidbit, she tells you that on windy days, she burns a small branch of bay before loading the bread so the wind doesn't steal the heat. You glance at the steady, slow smoke curling from the oven's vent and think perhaps it's working. While the bread bakes, you sit beneath an olive tree, watching a boy chase a chicken that clearly isn't in the mood for company. The air hums with insects, and the sun makes everything a little lazier than it needs to be. A man passes carrying a basket of round loaves wrapped in fig leaves bound with twine. He says the leaves keep the bread moist and add a hint of sweetness, then offers you one still warm from the oven. You break it open, and the steam rises like the smell of summer itself. Joke number 1 comes when you ask if the fig leaves are edible. He grins and says, "Only if you're part goat," before handing you a piece stripped of its wrapper. The bread inside is soft, slightly nutty, with just enough crust to keep your fingers happy. In the shade of another tree, 2 older women are grinding grain on a small handquarn. The rhythm is quick, the stones sounding familiar. They tell you they bake every 2 or 3 days, timing it to coincide with neighbors, so the oven never sits cold for long. Historians still argue whether rural bread was more nutritious than city bread due to less refined flour. Here, The darker crumb and deeper flavor seem to make their own case. A dog naps by the oven's side, lifting an ear only when the stone is moved to pull out the baked loaf. The woman sets it on a wooden board, and the crust crackles as it meets the cooler air. She taps it with her knuckles, hollow just right, then dusts off the bottom before handing it over to a waiting neighbor. Nearby, a girl tends a smaller pit oven, baking flatbreads directly on hot stones. She flips them with a stick, the edges blistered, the centers puffing like small pillows. She presses one into your hand, warning that it's hot. You tear off a piece. It tastes of smoke and something wild from the herbs needed inside. Joke number 2. You remark that it's better than any blanket on a cold night, and she says, "This one keeps your stomach warm too." As afternoon light leans toward gold, the villagers gather under a vine-draped trellis. They share bread, cheese, olives, and a jug of pale wine, passing each in easy rhythm. No one talks of prices or politics. They talk of rain, harvest, and the stubborn rooster who's been waking the street before dawn. The bread is passed in big pieces, torn by hand. Every so often, someone reaches for the olive oil jar, dipping their bread before returning it to the table. A quirky superstition surfaces when an old man points to a loaf cooling on the wall and warns that turning bread upside down invites misfortune. He writes it gently, brushing away a bit of flour from the crust. You make a mental note, deciding you'll never store a loaf wrong side up again. Joke number 3 arrives as the same man offers you a second helping, saying, "Oh, eat more. You look like you could survive 2 more days without bread, and that's dangerous." You accept, partly for the humor, mostly for the bread. The shadows grow longer and the ovens cool. The last loaves are wrapped, carried off down narrow lanes toward homes where they'll be the centerpiece of simple suppers. You walk back toward the road, the sound of quiet conversation and the faint scent of oregano trailing behind you. Out here, bread doesn't march toward empire. It sits, steady and rooted, waiting for you to return. The dusty country road dips toward the coast, where the smell of the sea creeps in before the horizon appears. You follow the sound of gulls, the clink of rigging against wooden masts, and the deep groan of timbers shifting under cargo. Ostia's port is busy but not frantic, the kind of place where work has been done the same way for so long that haste would seem almost rude. The air is heavy with brine, tar, and the faint sweetness of grain sacks resting in the sun. You're here for a different kind of loaf, not the warm, soft kind, cooling on a rack, but the stubborn, long-lasting bread meant to survive salt spray, rough handling, and months away from shore. Mainstream fact, Roman sailors and traders relied on a form of hard bread or biscuit often called panis nauticus, or simply hardtack, which could last for months if kept dry. It was more survival than indulgence, but its endurance made it as important as sails or oars. On the dock, a group of men is loading sacks of flour and barrels of salted fish into the hold of a grain ship bound for Massilia. Nearby, a baker in a sleeveless tunic tends a makeshift oven built on a low stone platform. He works with thick discs of dough, already baked once, now set to dry out entirely over the embers. When you pick one up, it's light but unyielding, the surface pale and rough like weathered plaster. Historians still argue whether these sea breads were baked twice from the start or rebaked from leftover loaves. Either way, the goal was the same: remove every hint of moisture. The baker here swears by the double bake method, insisting it makes for fewer complaints from sailors about mold. A quirky tidbit drifts from a deckhand leaning on the railing. Some crews etched simple designs into their hard bread before baking, anchors, waves, even crude portraits to tell their share apart or just to amuse themselves. He pulls one from his pouch to show you a crude dolphin with a lopsided grin. You suspect the grin is on purpose. The harbor wind ruffles your tunic as you watch the baker toss a finished biscuit onto a growing stack. He explains that these will be packed in clay jars or wrapped in waxed cloth to keep them dry. He also admits, with a grim smile, that most sailors soften them in wine or broth before eating. Joke number 1, he says, "If your teeth survive a year on these, you deserve a statue." And judging by the hardness under your fingers, you don't doubt it. Farther down the dock, a different kind of bread is being loaded. Dense loaves made with more salt than usual, wrapped tightly in woven reed mats. These are for shorter journeys, where a bit of softness is still worth the risk of spoilage. The scent is stronger, the crust darker, and you imagine the relief of eating one after weeks of nothing but hardtack. You step aboard a moored ship, feeling the deck shift under your weight. In the cramped galley, a young cook shows you how they store bread in netted hammocks slung from the beams, away from damp deck planks, but close enough to grab quickly in bad weather. He tosses you a small biscuit. It lands in your palm with the weight of something that might outlive you. Joke number 2 surfaces when he says, if you drop it overboard, it'll float long enough for a fish to file a complaint. You picture a dolphin lodging a formal grievance with Neptune. Back on shore, a group of sailors lounges near a pile of coiled rope, each with a chunk of bread in hand. One dips his into a bowl of oil bright with herbs, another into a cup of watered wine. They chew methodically, as if their jaws have learned the slow pace required for this kind of meal. They trade stories about ports where the bread was worse, laugh about biscuits so hard they had to be cracked with a hammer, and argue good-naturedly about which merchant ships keep the best supplies. Historians still argue whether Roman sailors baked aboard ship during long voyages or relied entirely on what they carried from port. The men here claim they sometimes rigged small clay ovens on deck in calm weather, though more often they just endured the dry chew. One older sailor swears he once baked a loaf on a flat rock over a brazier in the middle of the Tyrrhenian Sea. No one bothers to say whether it was edible. The tide shifts and the loading picks up pace. Sacks and barrels disappear into the ship's belly, followed by the baskets of bread. A boy scurries past with the last load, a wicker tray of hardtack discs stamped with the ship's name. You can't tell if the stamp is for pride or inventory. Joke number 3 comes from the captain himself, who, when asked if he eats the ship's bread, says, "Only if I run out of wood for the fire." You imagine him warming his hands over a biscuit like it's a log. The ship's ropes creak as they're loosed, and the deckhands wave lazily to the dock. You watch the vessel ease into the channel, its cargo sealed away in the dark, the bread among the most silent passengers aboard. As the sails catch the wind, you can almost taste the salt and hear the dry crunch that will follow the crew across every wave. You leave the briny air of Ostia behind, following a road that curls back toward the city, but you take a smaller lane when you hear the murmur of voices and the occasional low laugh. It leads you to a baker's courtyard lit by the glow of a banked fire. A small crowd sits in a loose circle, bread in hand, as an older woman spins a story that rises and falls like the slow swing of a pendulum. Here, bread is not just food, it's an omen, a messenger, a prop in tales older than the stones under your feet. Mainstream fact, across the Roman world, bread carried symbolic weight tied to superstitions, festivals, and even personal fortunes. Breaking bread could seal an agreement. Placing it upside down was considered bad luck in some places, and certain loaves were baked specifically as offerings to gods or household spirits. The storyteller lifts a small round loaf to illustrate her point. If your loaf cracks down the middle, she says, it means a journey is coming. She tears it apart for emphasis, steam curling into the night air. Historians still argue whether such interpretations were everyday beliefs or special to certain regions, but her audience leans in like they've heard these rules since childhood. A quirky tidbit slips into her tale. In her village, bakers used to score a cross into festival loaves, not only for even tearing, but to let the spirits escape before they can sour the bread. She admits she never knew which spirits these were, mischievous or protective, but the tradition stuck. She passes the loaf to a boy beside her who nibbles the crust and asks if bread can bring love. Without missing a beat, she says, "Only if you drop crumbs in the right path." Joke number 1, the boy's friend pipes up, "So that's why you feed pigeons," and the group chuckles. On a low table nearby sits a basket of oddly shaped rolls, spirals, knots, even one that looks like a coiled snake. The storyteller explains that these shapes echo charms from old rural rituals meant to ward off illness or invite good harvests. Some are brushed with oil, others dusted with seeds, each one smelling faintly of the oven's warmth. She offers you one shaped like a ring, saying it will keep your circle unbroken. A young man contributes a darker superstition. He swears that if you cut bread at night, you invite bad dreams. His grandmother always waited until morning, even if the loaf cooled in the dark. Historians still argue whether this was tied to practical concerns, like avoiding spoilage when bread sat open overnight, or to something less tangible. The conversation drifts to omens on the road. A woman claims she once set off for the Forum, only to have a loaf slip from her basket and land crust side up in the dust. She turned back immediately, convinced it was a warning. Joke number 2 comes from a neighbor who says, "That wasn't fate, that was a lazy knot in your basket," and the table ripples with laughter. A man in the corner breaks a roll and tosses a piece toward the fire. "For the Lairs," he says, "the household spirits said to protect the home." He explains that in some quarters, the first bite of a loaf was always given to them, especially if the bread was from a new batch or a special bake. The practice feels both ancient and practical. After all, feeding spirits costs little, and peace of mind is worth a crumb or two. The storyteller leans forward, voice dropping to a whisper, and describes a bread curse she once heard about. A loaf baked with a secret knot of herbs inside, meant to sour the temper of the person who ate it. Whether this was magic or just the strong bite of the herb, she won't say. Joke number 3, a man at the back mutters, "Must have been served at my wedding feast," and even the fire seems to laugh. The night deepens, the bread basket empties, and the fire sinks to glowing embers. People linger, swapping smaller stories, half memory, half invention. You taste the last bite of your ring-shaped roll and find that whether or not it holds any real magic, it's warm, fragrant, and pleasantly chewy. When the circle breaks apart, the storyteller hands you a small heel of bread wrapped in linen. "For your dreams," she says, as if you'll know exactly what to do with it. You tuck it away, stepping into the cool air where the shadows of the street reach toward you like long, lazy fingers. Somewhere behind you, the fire pops once, and the scent of baked grain follows you out into the night. Smoke greets you before sound does, sweet and resinous, the kind that folds into your clothes and stays all day. You follow it through a quiet lane toward a small temple where the doors stand open and the marble threshold remembers every sandal that has ever crossed it. Inside, the air is dim and warm, layered with incense and torchlight. The priest's voice unspools in measured phrases low enough to feel more than hear, and there on a side table you spot them, round, pale loaves, scored simply, waiting like patient witnesses. Mainstream fact: Romans offered bread, cakes, and grain to gods, both public and private. The most famous sacred preparation was mola salsa, salted spelt flour prepared by the Vestal virgins and sprinkled over sacrificial victims and offerings. You don't see a Vestal here, but you do see a small bowl of white meal and salt, a pinch already dusting the top of one loaf as if a tiny snow had fallen indoors. The gesture is calm, almost domestic, an altar that feels briefly like a kitchen. A thin priest with smoke-streaked fingers lifts a loaf and turns it, inspecting the base the way the guildmaster did. He nods once, sets it down, and breaks off a modest corner with both hands. The crack is soft, like dry bark. Acolytes step forward, each taking a piece to place on a bronze plate. The smell of warm wheat sidles up to the incense until both are a single drowsy perfume. You stand very still, listening to the hush that follows the breaking. It's the same silence you heard in the mixing room, how dough speaks best when you don't. The loaves themselves are not grand, no dolphin stamps, no fig confetti, no honey braids fit for Saturnalia. They are deliberate in their plainness, shapes you could reproduce with a good bench and a steady oven. Historians still argue whether temple loaves were baked by specialized religious staff, contracted bakers, or pious households taking turns. Your nose recognizes the clean, slightly sour fragrance of a careful ferment and guesses a professional hand nearby. Perhaps the guild's quiet fingerprints reach even here. At a side altar, a mother and her daughter set down a smaller loaf wrapped in fig leaves, tied with twine just as you saw in the village. The girl smooths the leaf's veins as though combing a friend's hair. A quirky tidbit travels with them in a whisper. In their street, families press a thumbprint into offering bread so the household gods, the Lairs, recognize their people at a glance. The mother guides the girl's thumb to the crumb, a small dimple no bigger than a coin. You remember the apprentices roll dimples so they don't feel lonely, and think how kitchens and shrines often share the same instincts. The priest circles the main altar, lifting a shallow dish of wine. He tilts a few drops onto the floor, libation first, as rules prefer, and then breaks another piece of bread, placing it beside a small heap of dates and a slice of cheese that sweats politely in the lamp heat. The offerings look like a modest lunch, and maybe that's the point. The gods are treated as honored guests, fed simply but attentively. Joke number 1 sneaks in as you picture a divine inspector stamping adequate crumb on the sky, then nodding toward the fire master about oven balance. You shift to a smaller chamber where the air is thicker with frankincense. Here the walls were soot shadows of past flames, and a low table holds cakes you've not seen before, little domes glazed with honey, topped with a single bay leaf. A temple servant names them Liba or Libum. and you recall Cato's old recipe: fresh cheese, flour, egg, honey, part cheesecake, part bread. Historians still argue whether Libum lived mostly on altars or mostly on dining tables. The smiles of the waiting worshippers suggest that both avenues were well traveled. An acolyte snips each cake with a bronze knife so everyone may taste without the awkwardness of wrestling sticky honey in public. A boy near you pinches his piece and sneezes. A pollen-dusted sunbeam flashes and a crumb lands on his nose. He goes cross-eyed trying to see it, a solemn calamity. A kindly old man plucks it away and eats it with priestly gravity, waste not in sight of gods or grandmothers. You remember the Annona line, the careful dignity of a drizzle of oil over a ration loaf, and feel the same reverence here. Bread is never casual when eyes are watching, mortal or divine. Toward the back stands a hearth shrine to the Penates, the guardians of the pantry. Two small terracotta figures look forever mid-smile. A woman arrives with a basket that smells like yesterday and rosemary. She places a heel of bread and a pinch of salt, then taps the basket twice with a wooden spoon. The rhythm is familiar. You've heard it against oven doors, the baker's paddle, even the guild's table. Joke number 2 arrives unbidden. If Rome had a national anthem, it might just be the sound of wood knocking flour-dusted wood. You follow a deacon down a corridor that grows quieter still, into a house church where candles throw gentler light across painted plaster. The gathering is small, voices careful, bread on a plate, with a pattern unlike the temples. Here the loaf is thin and pale, and the words over it are different too, newer, if that can be said, about something carried in mouths and memories. A hush settles with the weight you feel in your shoulders. Historians still argue whether the earliest Christian breaking of bread in Rome used leavened loaves like an everyday meal, or unleavened bread or unleavened bread with firmer symbolism. Either way, the gesture is shared, the pieces passed hand to hand with a tenderness you've seen everywhere. Flour meets fire. You stay at the edge, respectful, noticing how the incense here is replaced by beeswax and wool and the faintest ghost of wine. Back in the open temple court, a novice sweeps crumbs into his palm with an almost comical intensity. He says the pigeons get feisty if you leave offerings to them instead of the gods. He winks and adds, the gods do not peck, which feels like a theological position you're happy to endorse. He tips the crumbs into a clay bowl. Later, he says they'll be burned with the spent incense, a little ritual housekeeping that keeps sacred places from becoming snack bars. Joke number 3, you decide the city's first interfaith council could start by agreeing on one thing: crumb management. A silver bowl of mola salsa reappears. The priest pinches and sprinkles a final dusting over the remaining loaves, then sets one aside for the poor who come to the rear gate at dusk. Bread exits through many doors in this city, front steps of palaces, market counters, barracks gates, and here, a quiet hinge that opens onto need. The same patient recipe becomes a sacrament, a stipend, a snack, and a promise, depending on whose hands reach out. On your way out, you pass a niche with a small wooden fish pinned above it. Not gilded, not grand, just the humble shape you tapped in the mixing room. It hangs there like a wink from the kitchen to the altar, a reminder that superstition and sanctity often borrow each other's tools. You pause, offered a respectful tap, and feel silly and sincere at once. The city is generous with those paired moods. Outside, sun spills across the steps, bright enough to bleach the incense from your sleeves. A baker's boy is already arriving with tomorrow's loaves in a basket, linen corners tucked tight against the breeze. He nods to the priest, to you, to the pigeons negotiating jurisdiction on the balustrade. The boy disappears into the dim with his soft cargo, and you walk on, the temple's murmurs receding until they become part of the general hum, millstones turning, ovens breathing, markets bargaining, and somewhere, always, fingers breaking bread with the care of people who learned long ago that even the gods appreciate a good crumb. The streets are busier now, echoing with the rattle of cartwheels and the clipped calls of merchants trying to outshout one another. You drift toward a smaller plaza where two men stand nose to nose in front of a bakery stall, gesturing wildly over something that, at first glance, seems utterly harmless: a loaf of bread. Mainstream fact, bread quality in ancient Rome wasn't left entirely to chance. The state and the Bakers' Guild both had an interest in keeping loaves up to standard: size, weight, and even freshness. Dishonest bakers could be fined, publicly shamed, or, in persistent cases, banished from the trade altogether. This is not the kind of drama you'd expect from something as quiet as a bowl of wheat and water, yet here it is, drawing a modest audience. One man insists the loaf is underweight. The baker swears his scales are honest. You can see the loaf, and it does look lighter than its neighbor. Historians still argue whether weight disputes like this were mostly genuine or simply a customer's way of angling for a discount, but the scene plays out like theater. A boy runs to fetch the market inspector, who arrives with a small set of bronze weights and a look that says he's done this 100 times today. The inspector sets the loaf on the scale. The needle tips, not enough to make the baker guilty, but enough to raise an eyebrow. A quirky tidbit emerges as the inspector pulls out a sliver of dough from inside the loaf. Hollow pockets like these sometimes meant the baker had rushed fermentation, or worse, added extra air to make the loaf seem larger. Joke number 1, a man in the crowd mutters, "Should have baked it in a trumpet, then he could sell it as music." A ripple of laughter runs through the onlookers. The baker defends himself with the weary air of someone who has done so for years. He talks about uneven heat in the oven, how the outer crust forms before the crumb can expand, how even the best wheat behaves badly on damp days. You nod because you've seen enough ovens to know he might be telling the truth. The inspector decides on a warning rather than a fine, noting the baker's long membership in the guild. Still, the crowd hums with mixed verdicts, some satisfied, others certain that they've witnessed a minor scandal. A woman nearby complains about a loaf she bought last week that tasted too much of millstone, which you take to mean gritty with flour that wasn't properly sifted. The baker promises to replace it and blames the apprentice. You can almost hear the guildmaster's sigh from here. Joke number 2 slips in when an older man advises, "Next time, sell the grit as extra minerals and charge more." Historians still argue whether everyday Romans cared more about bread's flavor or its filling power. In lean years, taste took a backseat to satiety, but in good years, buyers could be surprisingly picky, demanding specific flour blends, preferring one bakery's crust color over another's. Standing here, you can feel both impulses at work, the urgency of getting a fair meal and the pride of choosing a loaf you actually like. The quarrel winds down, the inspector shuffling off to his next dispute. The baker returns to his bench, still grumbling, but his hands are already shaping the next round of dough. The air smells of warm crust and faint yeast, the kind that clings to your skin long after you've left. As you walk away, you pass a different stall where 2 bakers are comparing loaves from opposite ends of the city. One is darker, denser, and heavier, the other lighter and more fragrant. They cut slices, swap bites, and offer commentary with the solemnity of philosophers debating ethics. A quirky tidbit emerges from their banter. Some customers would carry their favorite baker's bread all the way across town, even passing dozens of other stalls, simply because they swore by one oven's heat or one hand's kneading. Joke number 3 comes from a passing soldier who eyes both loaves and says, "I'll take whichever one doubles as a shield." The bakers laugh, then immediately start arguing over which bread would block an arrow better. By the time you reach the end of the plaza, the earlier quarrel has already folded back into the rhythm of the day. Bread disputes, it seems, are as common as the morning bell, sharp for a moment, then softened into memory like a crust and broth. You glance back once and see the underweight loaf being sold after all, this time to a man who bites into it on the spot, chews thoughtfully, and shrugs as if to say that scandal or not, it will do. The next morning begins with a different kind of heat, not from ovens but from the sun already baking the white marble steps of the basilica. You find yourself following a slow-moving cluster of people into its cool, echoing interior. The air smells faintly of parchment, wax, and dust, and the hum of conversation is replaced by the formal, measured tones of a magistrate presiding over a public hearing. Today's docket, you overhear, concerns dishonest weights and fraudulent loaves. Mainstream fact. In Rome, bakers were subject to regulations enforced by both guild officials and civic magistrates. Laws could dictate the standard weight of a loaf, the proportion of certain grains in public bread, and even the price, especially for the state-subsidized panis plebeius. Violations could result in fines, loss of guild membership, or, in notorious cases, corporal punishment. You settle onto a bench at the side, feeling the room's odd mix of courtroom gravity and market gossip. At the front, a baker in a flour-stained tunic shifts nervously as a clerk reads out the charge. selling loaves that failed to meet the mandated weight for Annona rations. His defense is immediate and passionate. He claims the grain shipment from Alexandria was damp, producing flour heavier than usual, so he used less of it to keep the loaf from being a dense brick. Historians still argue whether such allowances were officially recognized or simply tolerated when inspectors were sympathetic. The magistrate gestures for a scale to be brought forward. An assistant places one of the accused loaves on one side, a bronze weight on the other. The balance tips, not dramatically, but enough to confirm the shortfall. A quirky tidbit follows. The clerk mentions an old regulation requiring bakers to mark their loaves with a distinctive stamp, so faulty bread could be traced back to the source. You remember the dolphin-stamped rounds from the market and realize how easy it would be to spot a repeat offender. The baker sighs, wipes his hands on his apron, and offers to compensate the shorted customers with extra loaves. The magistrate, unimpressed, issues a fine instead, reminding him that bread is the city's peace. Tamper with it, and you stir more than dough. Joke number 1 comes from a man behind you who whispers, "And here I thought bread was the city's carbs," drawing a few muffled chuckles. Next, a complaint from a customer who claims a baker mixed barley flour into a wheat loaf without telling anyone. Barley, cheaper and coarser, wasn't necessarily bad, but for a customer expecting pure wheat, it was a trick. The accused baker insists it was necessity. The wheat sacks arrived torn, the loss needed covering, and barley kept the bread from shrinking. Historians still argue whether blending grains was a form of fraud or a long-standing tolerated adaptation during shortages. The magistrate leans back, stroking his chin, then announces a warning rather than a fine, provided the baker marks mixed loaves clearly from now on. A scribe scribbles down the ruling with the weariness of someone who has written it many times before. Joke number 2, the scribe mutters just loud enough for you to hear, might as well carve it into the basilica wall and save ink. You notice a side table piled with confiscated bread, loaves, too small, too burnt, or oddly shaped. An assistant breaks them open for inspection, checking for underbaked centers or suspiciously hollow crusts. One loaf crumbles almost to dust, the result of too much chaff in the flour. The assistant tuts and tosses it into a bin destined for animal feed. A particularly lively case involves a baker accused of selling yesterday's bread as fresh, and the evidence? A loaf with a suspiciously dull crust and a faint vinegary smell. The baker defends himself by saying it was baked early, before sunrise, not the previous day. Historians still argue whether yesterday's bread was truly undesirable. Many households preferred it for toasting or soaking in broth. But here, the point is freshness, not preference. The magistrate orders the baker to offer such bread at a lower price, clearly marked. Joke number 3 arrives when an old man in the gallery says, "If they fine him for stale bread, they'll have to fine my wife's cooking too." His neighbor gives him a friendly shove, and the tension in the room eases for a moment. By midday, the cases wind down. The magistrate closes with a short speech about the importance of fairness in trade, particularly in bread, which he calls the heartbeat of the people. You watch as bakers leave, some chastened, others muttering about inspectors with no sense of oven work. Outside, the sun is harsher, the chatter livelier, and the market already smells of fresh crusts. You pause to watch one of the fined bakers at his stall. He weighs a loaf twice before handing it over, then gives the customer an extra roll just to be sure. You can't tell if it's guilt, good marketing, or a bit of both, but the customer smiles, and that seems to settle the matter. Walking away, you pass a guild notice board where today's rulings are already posted in neat wax tablet script. You run your fingers over the shallow grooves, thinking how a few missing ounces of bread can carry you from the warmth of the bakery to the echo of the court. In Rome, bread isn't just sustenance, it's law, reputation, and for some, the very line between welcome and exile. The city quiets as the afternoon heat pushes most people indoors, but you find yourself walking toward the edges where streets narrow and the air smells faintly of wild thyme and sun-warmed stone. Here, past the bustle of the markets, lies a quieter world, the necropolis. You've heard it before, almost in passing, bread's for the living, but some loaves are meant for those who no longer rise with the sun. Mainstream fact, in ancient Rome, offerings at tombs often included bread, wine, and sometimes eggs or flowers. During festivals like Parentalia, families would visit graves, share a meal, and leave portions for the dead, a blend of remembrance and ritual hospitality. Historians still argue whether the dead were believed to literally consume these offerings or if they served purely as symbolic gestures to honor their memory. The path between tombs is shaded by cypress trees, their stillness broken only by the occasional whisper of wind. You watch as a family approaches a stone mausoleum, carrying a basket covered with linen. The father kneels and sets out a small, round loaf, crust dusted with flour, on a flat ledge beneath the carved name. Beside it, he places a clay cup of watered wine. The bread is unremarkable. No honey glaze, no exotic spices. But its simplicity feels deliberate, a quiet act of continuity. A quirky tidbit emerges as the eldest son reaches into the basket and produces a second loaf, this one slightly stale. He breaks it into pieces and scatters them on the ground. You learn this is for the manes, the spirits of the dead who linger unseen, sometimes appeased with humble crumbs. It's not unlike feeding pigeons, except the diners here are invisible and considerably less messy. Joke number 1 floats in your mind. At least the manes don't leave droppings on the statues. Nearby, an older woman sits on a low bench beside a marble urn, cradling a loaf in her lap as if it were a small child. She hums under her breath and occasionally breaks off a piece to set on the urn's base. You notice her bread is flecked with rosemary, a plant tied to memory in Roman custom. Historians still argue whether rosemary loaves were common in funerary rites or simply a personal touch passed down through certain families. In the next row, a small group is sharing what looks like a modest picnic. Olives, cheese, figs, and bread. They laugh softly, telling stories, and every so often they place a morsel from their own plates on a shared wooden board, which they then set beside a headstone. The idea is that the dead are invited to join the meal, just as they would have in life. It's oddly comforting. No solemn wailing, just a slow afternoon and good company. One tomb has a small built-in niche shaped like a funnel. You watch as a boy pours wine through it, disappearing into the earth below. You've heard of these libation tubes before, channels that led directly to the burial chamber so offerings could reach the deceased. Bread, too, could be crumbled and dropped in. Joke number 2, you picture the dead beneath, catching crumbs like a grateful neighbor catching figs over the garden wall. A priest walks past, carrying a basket of plain loaves for those who come without offerings. He sets one down at each unvisited grave, murmuring a brief blessing. The bread is simple, no score marks, no stamps, but warm enough that you can still see the faintest trace of steam. He explains to a curious child that the warmth is for the living, who can feel it. The dead, he says with a smile, are patient enough for cool bread. You pass a large family tomb where an inscription shows 2 hands breaking bread, an image of unity and continuity. The loaf depicted has 6 clear score marks, and you recall seeing similar patterns in the market, baked for easy dividing among diners. Historians still argue whether such depictions on tombs were purely symbolic or indicated the deceased's profession, perhaps a baker or a grain merchant proud of their trade. Joke number 3 comes as you notice a stray dog stretched out in the shade of a tall monument, one paw resting possessively on a stale loaf. No one seems inclined to take it from him. Perhaps they figure even stray dogs need their share of ritual bread. By the time you leave, the shadows have stretched long, and the air has taken on that cool edge that promises evening. The bread left on the tombs will be gone by morning, eaten by animals, crumbled by wind, or perhaps, in the quiet faith of some, carried off by unseen hands. You step back into the city proper, your nose catching once again the scent of fresh baking from far-off ovens. It strikes you how bread's journey in Rome runs full circle, from fields to markets, from tables to temples, and finally here to the silent company of the departed. Evening settles over the city, and you follow the glow of oil lamps toward the riverbank. Here, between the warehouses and the low, lapping water, the air smells of grain dust and damp rope. You've stumbled into a gathering not of bakers, but of millers, men and women who stand at the start of bread's long journey, their hands more accustomed to grinding stones than kneading dough. Mainstream fact, in Rome, milling grain was often done in large public mills powered by animals, slaves, or in some cases water wheels. These mills supplied flour to bakeries across the city, and the quality of their work could make or break the flavor of a loaf. Historians still argue whether millers were considered part of the Bakers' Guild or maintained their own separate associations, but their influence on bread was undeniable. You join a loose semicircle around a broad-shouldered man who's telling a story about a grain shipment from overseas, Egyptian wheat so fine he swears it made loaves that practically floated off the table. He punctuates the tale by rubbing flour between his fingers, letting it fall in a soft drift. A quirky tidbit emerges. Some millers like to perfume their grinding stones with herbs, not for flavor, but to mask the faint musty smell of old grain. Joke number 1, a younger miller mutters, or to trick customers into thinking the bread cures colds, and earns a shove from his neighbor. Nearby, a mule is tethered to a large rotary mill. Its steady plod turns the heavy stone, and you can hear the low crunch of grain being reduced to flour. The miller explains that the speed of the turn matters. Too fast, and the grain scorches, lending the flour a bitter taste. Too slow, and the work takes all day. You imagine the patience this balance requires, especially in the heat of summer. One woman, her forearms dusted white, talks about how she prefers to leave a bit of the bran in the flour for texture. She says it gives the bread something to chew on, while her husband swears the city folk want their loaves as white as polished marble. Historians still argue whether whiteness in bread was truly a status symbol across all of Rome, or just in certain urban centers where wealthy buyers could afford the finer sifting. The conversation drifts to the hazards of milling. Grain dust, one man warns, can catch fire in a sudden puff if a spark meets the right cloud. It's rare, but he claims to have seen it once, like the gods sneezing. Joke number 2 comes from an older miller who says, "That's why I never trust Jupiter with a pepper shaker." And the group chuckles softly. A boy brings over a small hand mill, the kind used in homes. He offers you the handle and you take it, feeling the satisfying resistance as the stones grind together. The sound is low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic, the sort of thing that could lull you to sleep if your arms didn't start aching after a few minutes. The woman beside you nods approvingly, saying that bread made from flour you've milled yourself always tastes sweeter, even if it's just your imagination. They pass around a loaf baked from today's grind, still warm from the oven. The crust is thick, the crumb dense, but the flavor is rich and nutty. Someone tears a piece for you, and the heat seeps into your fingers. It's humble bread, far from the gilded honey loaves sold in the city center, but it has a kind of honesty that's hard to dress up or fake. As the night deepens, a few of the millers light small clay lamps and continue talking shop. Grain prices, the temperament of different animals at the mill, the way a storm can change the humidity in the stones. Joke number 3 slips in when a man says his mule knows the route to the bakery better than he does, and another replies, "Then let the mule set the price next time." You step back from the circle, watching the steady turn of the big mill under lamplight. The mule blinks slowly, unbothered by the hour, as the stone continues its slow, patient work. In that sound, the soft grind of grain into flour, you hear the first heartbeat of every loaf in Rome, long before it's shaped, scored, and slid into the oven. Dawn slides back over the city, and you're drawn toward the clang and bustle of the docks. The scent here is a heady mix of brine, pitch, and, faintly beneath it all, grain. Long, low ships are moored side by side, their hulls heavy with the wheat that keeps Rome's bread ovens alive. Mainstream fact: much of the grain for the city's bread came from distant provinces, particularly Egypt, whose fertile Nile delta could feed millions. Grain ships sailed across the Mediterranean, arriving at Ostia and then making their way upriver to Rome. Historians still argue whether the state's grain imports were managed more for political control than simple food supply. After all, a well-fed populace was far less likely to riot. You watch as dock workers form a human chain, passing heavy sacks from ship to shore. Each is stamped with a seal indicating origin and weight, a kind of ancient barcode. A quirky tidbit emerges when one foreman points out that some sacks arrive dusted with fragrant herbs, not for flavor, but to keep pests away during the voyage. Joke number 1. A sailor grins and says the herbs are to keep Romans from noticing the occasional extra protein, meaning weevils, and no one pretends to be shocked. Nearby, a scribe perches on a crate, noting each sack's arrival in wax tablet shorthand. He pauses to shake his cramped hand and mutters that his work is feeding the city, one cramp at a time. The cargo is weighed again on large balance scales, and any shortfall earns a stern look from the grain inspector. You hear murmurs that light sacks might mean the ship's crew taxed themselves in transit. Historians still argue whether such petty theft was rampant or rare, though judging by the inspector's vigilance, it wasn't unheard of. You follow a cart loaded with sacks toward a warehouse where the grain will be stored before being sent to mills. Inside, the air is dry and thick with a fine dust that coats your lips and tongue. A man at the far end is shoveling grain into a bin fitted with a trapdoor. He says it makes loading carts easier. He also warns you not to strike sparks here. Grain dust can explode if the gods are feeling mischievous. In one corner, a baker in a tidy tunic is inspecting the latest shipment. He rubs a pinch of grain between his fingers, nodding at its quality, then slips a few kernels into his mouth. "Good wheat bites back," he says, crunching. Joke number 2, a dock worker leans over and adds, "Better than some of the bread it turns into," earning a ripple of laughter. A cart creaks past, bound for the public granaries. You decide to follow, and soon the road opens into a massive complex of stone and timber. The granary smells faintly sweet, like dried grass, and its shadowy interior is cool even under the rising sun. Workers climb ladders to pour grain into vast storage bins, while others sweep stray kernels into sacks. Nothing goes to waste here. A foreman explains that the grain is stored separately by origin and type, Egyptian wheat in one bin, Sicilian in another. He says bakers sometimes request blends, swearing that a mix of two regions makes for a superior loaf. Historians still argue whether such blending was widespread practice or the luxury of well-connected bakers. As you leave, you notice a cat slinking along the wall, eyes sharp for mice. The foreman says she's been here for years, paid in grain and affection. Joke number 3 slips from a passing worker. She's the only one here who doesn't steal, and the foreman smirks but doesn't disagree. Back outside, the carts roll on, carrying grain deeper into the city's veins. You follow their path for a while, imagining each sack's slow transformation, from dry kernel to fragrant loaf, from distant field to Roman table. The river glints in the morning light, and behind you, the dock workers are already turning to the next ship, the next link in the endless chain that keeps bread and Rome itself alive. By midday, you find yourself back in the Forum, though the usual hum of politics and trade is softer today. The center of attention is a temporary wooden stage where a public cookery demonstration is underway. Sponsored, you overhear, by a wealthy grain merchant keen to advertise his latest shipment from Egypt. Mainstream fact: in Rome, public feasts and cooking displays were sometimes staged to curry favor with the people, especially during political campaigns or major festivals. Bread often featured prominently, not just plain loaves, but sweetened or spiced varieties meant to impress. Historians still argue whether such events were primarily civic generosity or carefully calculated propaganda. You edge closer as a cook in a spotless tunic slices into a round loaf dusted with sesame seeds. The crust gives way with a soft crackle, and a warm, nutty aroma drifts across the crowd. A quirky tidbit emerges when he explains that the seeds were imported from the East at great expense, and yet the audience's first question is whether they get stuck in your teeth. Joke number 1 comes from a man beside you who mutters, "They're worth it if you want to remember lunch until dinner." The cook moves on to a sweeter bread, glazed with honey and sprinkled with crushed pistachios. He tells the crowd it's a recipe borrowed from Syria, adapted with Roman wheat for a lighter crumb. Historians still argue whether such adaptations were genuine cross-cultural exchanges or opportunistic tweaks to local tastes. Either way, the loaf disappears quickly when slices are handed out. On a nearby table, assistants prepare dough for flatbreads. They stretch it thin, slap it onto hot stones, and flip it in a practiced rhythm. The smell is irresistible, earthy, toasty, with a faint whisper of char. One assistant rubs a piece with garlic and a drizzle of olive oil, explaining it's a favorite among soldiers returning from long campaigns. A large amphora of olive oil stands to one side, its surface glistening in the sun. The cook dips a brush made from thyme sprigs into the oil and paints it over another loaf, fresh from the oven. He says it keeps the crust supple for longer, a trick learned from bakers in the warmer provinces. Joke number 2, a woman near the front asks if it works on husbands, and the ripple of laughter suggests the question was rhetorical. In the middle of the demonstration, a small commotion arises when a young boy manages to snag a still warm roll and darts into the crowd. The cook shakes his head in mock outrage, saying he'll burn his fingers before he fills his stomach. Historians still argue whether bread theft in Rome was seen as a petty nuisance or a symptom of deeper food insecurity. Here, it's met with indulgent smiles. The final act is the unveiling of a colossal loaf, nearly the size of a wagon wheel, decorated with patterns scored into the crust before baking. The cook says it's purely for display, but adds that it could feed an entire insula for a day if it had to. The merchant sponsoring the event steps forward, beaming, and announces that slices will be given to the crowd. Joke number 3 slips in when someone shouts, "Start with the ones who asked about the sesame seeds." As the bread is cut and passed around, you notice the crowd's easy warmth. Neighbors sharing bites, children comparing crumbs, strangers nodding at one another. The merchant watches it all with a satisfied expression, knowing that this simple act of feeding has bought him more goodwill than a dozen speeches. You linger at the edge, chewing a piece of the honey bread. It's soft and rich, but what lingers most is the hum of voices, the sense that in Rome, bread isn't just food, it's theater, diplomacy, and for a lucky few, a reason to gather in the sun on a warm afternoon. The streets feel different now, quieter, as if the city itself has drawn a long breath and let it out. You notice it first in the bakeries. The ovens still glow, but fewer hands tend them. Some shops that once bustled from dawn to dusk now open late or not at all. Mainstream fact: in the later centuries of the Roman Empire, economic decline, political instability, and disruptions to trade routes strained the bread supply. Skilled bakers were fewer, either leaving the city for more stable work or losing access to quality grain. Historians still argue whether the decline in bread quality was a symptom of Rome's troubles or a cause for further discontent among its people. You step into a bakery you visited before. The air is still warm, but the smell is fainter. Less of fresh wheat, more of wood smoke and faint ash. The baker, a stooped man with flour ground into the creases of his hands, offers you a loaf that's smaller than usual. Same price, and he says with a wry smile, just more concentrated. Joke number 1, you nod and suggest he might start selling them as personal pan loaves, which earns a weary chuckle. The dough, he admits, now contains more barley and millet, grains easier to find but coarser in texture. A quirky tidbit emerges when he shows you a jar of ground chestnuts, an improvised filler to stretch what wheat he has. He says it adds a faint sweetness, though not everyone appreciates it. You take a piece and taste it. The crumb is denser, the crust darker, and it leaves a faint dry feeling on your tongue. Outside, you pass another bakery where the oven door hangs slightly crooked. A young apprentice sweeps the floor with a bundle of reeds, pausing to explain that his master left months ago, called to serve in the military. The boy is learning from memory and scraps of advice from neighbors. His loaves are uneven in size, but he shrugs. Better than no bread. Historians still argue whether apprentices kept the baking trade alive in these lean years or simply kept its shell standing until better times returned. You wander to the grain market, once a riot of voices and color. Now half the stalls stand empty. A merchant leans against a post, explaining that the last shipment from Egypt was delayed for weeks by bad weather and political trouble in Alexandria. His remaining sacks are expensive, and he's rationing them to his best customers. Joke number 2, a bystander mutters that best customers means anyone who can still pay in gold. In the poorer districts, you see more people baking at home. Small flatbreads cooked on portable braziers, loaves baked in communal ovens when enough neighbors can pool their flour. A woman offers you a piece of her bread, made with half wheat, half lentil flour. It's earthy, filling, and surprisingly pleasant, though she admits she misses the softer loaves of years past. The bakeries that remain open have adapted in small ways: the smaller portions, lower oven temperatures to save fuel, and the reusing of old bread by soaking it in water and baking it again. Historians still argue whether these techniques were born from desperation or if they became part of the city's enduring food culture. You end the day on a street where once 3 bakeries competed for customers. Now only one survives. Its door is propped open, and the baker inside, an older woman with quick eyes, works steadily despite the emptiness. She tells you she's kept going because someone has to, and because she likes the quiet. Joke number 3 comes when she says, "At least now I know exactly who's stealing from me. It's just me." As you walk away, you can't help noticing how the scent of bread, once thick in the air, now fades more quickly into the smells of smoke, damp stone, and the slow creep of time. You wander beyond the city walls now, following the road, until the sounds of Rome thin to a distant hum. Here the air smells sharper, crushed grass, damp earth, and the faint tang of wild fennel. The fields open wide and you see them, long wavering lines of wheat bending under the breeze, still months away from harvest. Mainstream fact, the bread at fed Rome often began in the countryside. In estates called latifundia, vast agricultural lands worked by slaves, tenant farmers, or hired laborers. These estates supplied both local markets and distant cities. Historians still argue whether the consolidation of farmland into these massive estates strengthened Rome's food supply or left it dangerously dependent on the fortunes of a few powerful landowners. You're greeted by a farmer with sun-darkened skin and a grin that shows more gaps than teeth. He gestures for you to walk with him between the wheat rows. The plants whisper against your legs, and you can hear the faint hum of insects working just above the stalks. A quirky tidbit emerges as he explains that some farmers plant poppies along the edges of their fields, not for beauty, but because they believe the flowers protect the grain from pests. Joke number 1, he adds with a wink, and they make the place look fancier than it is. A group of workers is repairing a section of irrigation channel. They shovel wet soil, guiding the flow of water from a nearby stream. The farmer tells you this water is the lifeblood of the wheat. Too little and the plants wither, too much and the roots rot. Historians still argue whether ancient irrigation techniques in Italy matched the sophistication of those in Egypt and Mesopotamia, or whether Roman farmers simply learned enough to keep the fields alive year after year. Farther on, a pair of oxen pull a wooden plow through a patch of fallow earth. The smell of turned soil is rich, almost sweet. The plowman pauses to wipe his brow, then jokes that the oxen complain less than cousins when asked to work, which earns a laugh from the woman sowing seeds behind him. You reach a granary built right on the estate, smaller than the cities but still impressive. The walls are thick to keep the grain cool and the door is barred with heavy timber. Inside, the air is dry, carrying a faint, nutty scent. The farmer says storing grain here means the bread in Rome will be made from wheat harvested just weeks earlier, not months old from foreign ships. A cart rattles past, piled high with sacks destined for a local mill. The driver waves, calling that if you follow him, you might catch a batch of flour being bagged before it's sent to the city. Joke number 2, the farmer calls after him, "Don't spill any. Rome will blame me." You stop by a shaded grove where workers take their midday rest. They eat bread baked that morning from last year's harvest, tearing it into chunks to share with olives and cheese. One man offers you a piece. It's coarse but hearty, with a chew that lingers. You chew slowly, tasting the direct line between this field and the city's crowded markets. Historians still argue whether estates like this were more efficient than small family farms, or simply more profitable for their owners. Standing here, you can see both truths, the abundance of land and labor, and the absence of the small personal touches you've seen in city bakeries. As you turn to leave, the farmer points to the horizon where the wheat blurs into the sky. "That's where Rome's bread begins," he says, "and where it ends too, if we're not careful." Joke number 3 pops into your head. You tell him you'll start calling the city a big loaf with marble frosting, and he laughs so loudly a flock of crows lifts from the far edge of the field. Evening leans against the lintel as you slip back into the bakery. The city beyond is a murmur. Here, the last warmth clings to bricks and breathes through the open mouths of cooling ovens. The bench is mostly bare. A few crumbs sparkle in lamplight like constellations that never made it into anyone's horoscope. You sit on the low stool near the paddle hooks, elbows on knees, and draw a final loaf close, the one the apprentice set aside, the one no customer claimed, the one that feels like it waited for you on purpose. The crust is darker than this morning's parade pieces, matte where the festival loaves were glossy. When you tap the base, the hollow knock answers like a neighbor behind a wall. "I'm here, don't rush." You cradle it in the cloth you've been carrying since the mill, the same square that carried soldiers' rations and hid a honey roll from a bold street kid. The cloth smells faintly of smoke, rosemary, and the day's long list of places: temple incense, brine from Ostia, dust from a magistrate's bench. Bread remembers. The cloth keeps the notes. You tear the loaf open. Steam ghosts out, sweet and clean, carrying the soft tang of yesterday's leaven. Mainstream fact. In Pompeii, archaeologists found carbonized round loaves, panis quadratus, scored into wedges and sometimes marked with stamps. proof that the evening smell you're breathing has a twin trapped forever in 79 CE. You picture those blackened rounds, their spoke-like cuts still visible, and you handle this loaf with the same care you'd give a potsherd in a museum, except you eat it, which museums generally discourage. Joke number 1, you promise the loaf a dignified end and then gnaw the heel like a satisfied stray dog. The apprentice sweeps slowly, reed broom whispering across the tiles. He nods at your seat, a little shy. Behind him, the wooden fish sits on its shelf above the bench, cracked down the spine catching the lamplight. You reach up and give it a quiet tap. Somewhere between the guild's stamped dolphins, the temple thumbprints, and this humble fish, you've collected a pocket full of rituals that all mean the same thing. May the next loaf behave. The apprentice grins, mimics the tap, and tucks the broom away like he's putting a child to bed. The firemaster lifts the oven door a finger's breadth, letting the last heat sigh out. A shallow shimmer of warmth rolls across the room and settles over your shoulders. You break off another piece, crust shard, soft interior, and drag it through a shallow saucer of oil the baker's wife left on the table. Green gold, peppery, the kind that clears your thoughts in the gentlest possible way. The oil holds an echo of hillside wind. The bread carries the mill's slow thunder. You chew until chewing is just rhythm. On the wall hangs today's wax tablet of tallies, rounds, flats, soldiers' discs, Anana batches, perfect bakes with the apprentice's secret marks. The lines cut by stylists have caught flour dust and look like pale rivers. Historians still argue whether the distinctive scoring of Panis Quadratus was primarily for portioning, carrying, branding, or all three. You look at tonight's loaf, scored but not string-tied, and think the answer will always be, it depends, on the oven, the customer, the hour, the weather, the mood of a jar of leaven that sometimes decides to be a philosopher. A gentle knock at the shutter, the sentry from the barracks, off duty now, without his helmet, hair still flattened like reeds after a swim. He doesn't ask, only raises 2 fingers in question. The baker hands him a small loaf wrapped in a corner of linen. He tucks it under his arm the way he did his gladius this morning and nods, thanks. You see the Anona line again in his quiet gesture, the temple's rear gate, the priest's basket at the necropolis. Bread exits through many doors. A cat you haven't met before trots in with the confidence of a foreman and hops onto the cooling rack's bottom rung. She tucks her paws and blinks at you, a soft managerial stare. The baker scratches her chin. She leans so hard into his hand she nearly tips off. Quirky tidbit. He says she arrived during a storm last winter and has refused every attempt to relocate her to the granary, preferring the evening's faint heat and the chance to supervise crumb disposal. You concede she's overqualified for both roles. Joke number 2, the baker calls her Domina Panis, and you resolve to address her as my lady should she ever audit your crust. The baker sits, stretches his wrists, and asks about your day. You answer in smells and textures because that's the language this room understands. Fig leaves and ship tar, sesame and smoke, vinegar on stale crust, dust from the basilica's floor, thyme crushed under sandals in a village lane. He nods at each, like tallying sacks of grain at the dock. When you mention the guild's wooden stamps, he reaches to a shelf and sets one in your palm, a wheat sheaf inside a tiny wreath. It's warm from the day. He says it brands reputation long after a loaf is gone, so he uses it sparingly. You imagine a customer's memory wearing that emblem like a seal. He asks, almost offhand, if you think the city will always bake the same bread. You roll a crumb between finger and thumb until it makes a soft, flowery squeak. Historians still argue whether Rome's daily bread changed more in recipe or simply in circumstance. You think of barley stretchers, chestnut flour, soldiers' hardtack, imperial showpieces, the countryside's olive branch loaves, the temple's plain rounds, and you answer that the bread is marched, yes, but in loops, circling back with each season, each shortage, each small invention that turned out to be a remembered habit in disguise. The apprentice returns with a tiny jug and 2 cups. He pours watered wine enough to tint the bottom, and the 3 of you touch rims without ceremony. You raise your cup to the donkey that turned the morning stones, to the mule who knew the mill road by heart, to the boy with ring breads like edible bracelets, to the magistrate's bronze weights shaped like ducks, to the cat who swears she runs quality control. Joke number 3, you add a toast to the wooden fish for services rendered beyond all reasonable superstition. and even the fire master laughs. Outside, a cart rattles by. Somewhere, two neighbors argue gently about nothing. A pigeon negotiates with the night. The last oven gives a final tick as brick contracts. The baker stands, checks the latch, and drapes a damp cloth over the leaven jar so the surface won't crust. You stand too, brush a few crumbs from your lap, and tuck the last corner of the heel into your cloth. You think about graves with libation tubes, about Saturnalia braids that wore honey like jewelry, about soldiers who softened ship's biscuit and wine and called it supper, about the quiet dignity of a ration loaf's even weight. All of them moved toward this moment, this unremarkable, perfect bite in a cooling room. You're the last to the door. You reach back, tap the wooden fish one more time, and close the shutter until only a slice of lamplight escapes. The alley exhales cool air. You step into it, bread warm against your palm, a small moon that will not last the night. The city's dark is never empty. It's full of ovens remembering their glow, of millstones turning in dreams, of cats with managerial ambitions, of stamped loaves parading through someone else's story. You walk slowly, letting the crust crackle under your thumb, and you don't hurry, because you know this march is long and uneventful and exactly right. The street loosens into wider quiet, and you let your steps grow smaller, softer, as though the stones prefer not to be woken again. The loaf in your hand cools by degrees, giving back the day's heat in one steady breath, and the smell that rises now is gentler. Faint wheat, a whisper of smoke, the memory of oil where you dipped the heel. Windows above you blink to embers, shutters meeting with careful taps, and somewhere a late broom finishes its last patient sweep. You carry on without needing to look, because the way is simple and the night is kind. The air has changed, rounder, slower, and even the river seems to drift with a tired smile, content to hold the moonlight a little longer. If you pause, and you do, you can hear the far mill in its sleep, a sound like a cat purring behind a wall. You can hear the ovens echo in your sleeves, where the warmth has settled, like a shawl someone draped over your shoulders without asking. You lean against the doorframe and let your back rest. The crust yields under your thumb, a small, pleasant crumble, and you think of the wooden fish, of stamps pressed into soft dough, of thumbprints for household gods who prefer modesty over spectacle. You breathe in longer now, kinder now, and the breath leaves you without urgency. Tomorrow's flour will arrive in sacks. Tomorrow's stones will turn. Tomorrow's hands will fold dough into quiet architecture, and none of it needs you to hurry tonight. So you let the last sounds thin. A cart becomes a murmur. A pigeon becomes a thought. The watchman's step becomes a lull. The loaf cools to the room's temperature, and you keep one final bite for morning, a small promise folded into cloth. Let the shutters close. Let the street dim. Let the city hum soften to a thread. You're warm, you're fed, you're carried. Sleep finds you where you stand, and it is gentle.